It's going great, bit stressed the last week, but yet.
Why stressed? From the studies or from work?
Courage, Mary. Courage for our friends.
Form ranks, you maggots! Form ranks! Pikes in front! Archers behind!
Hey, man! Take your area down the left flank! Gamling!
Heroes TE Bonus LT Patrick, how are you?
Hello, Taco.
Good.
Hello, Patrick, how are you? I'm doing good, Taco. I'm doing good.
Spears shall be shaken!
Study, but also at home there is a constant bad vibe.
A sword
Bad vibe.
Amazing! And the sun
Happy.
rises!
So how are you doing, Taco?
Whatever happens, stay with me. I'll look after you.
Are you sick? Is it because it's cold?
Right now! Right now! Right!
Hi Memon, sleep 14 hard, sleep 14 hard, sleep
Memon
14
is sleeping
hard.
right now. Okay. Island God. Ooh, Bunny Fury. Did it show up? I
How was
wonder.
your weekend, Byros?
The weekend was pretty good. Me and Memo had a lot of things to do. But overall, we relaxed. It was very relaxing. But a little cool. How about yours, guys? Do you guys like Lord of the Rings? Memo's favorite character is Gimli. And Legolas. Boy.
La I pala vale no. E la I pala vale ai hoi. Kuno a keli palu la I. O kalo mai. Kala. A mai kanaka. E la ke o koko. Ke pau ala.
Can you guys hear everything, by the way?
Pupu noi ka ia loa ka ina. E ia mai o ka iana, le popo polo, kau kele, le po eka eka. I pau mai ele puai, o e hoi ke nā, ka iana. Halele vale. O he vale ana, I ke la popo ke ia popo, ona kai e valu. O ko iara make, o ko make. Hei a ko ka u maka, ke ku maina, o ko maui, o ka ikili nui. Ho e no, ka make pauloa.
Kanaka aha la e mā ana ka ai ia. O ka ili ke akua kaua. Ke nana ne puu. I ka hopa pū mai ia la I pala. O kena vahi o pū nui. O au variana. I ka ho o pili pili mai e ia me kahikiri. Pai o pea. Pai vale. Ai ia hakinaku. Ia hakinaku. A o ua o punui la. Lave vale oia. I lima I kaikano mau. A ia nei oia. E ho o hinu ai. I ka e lao o konoa. O vaika o ne puali. O ho o hinu di he. Ke ho o pa mai.
Ai e.
Malule na ie. Oh. Vai macau. Cai pualia. Te akilia.
E mai ahu lau oe o ta awo waho. E kai ana. Ai mai au ane ia mātau ia mai o. Aho o mai I holau ia oe. I te lua one ele. Tohu kau I hana I tō kaina.
Ekeoa, you have no idea what is coming. You will never understand. You were born a fool. I did not come here for battle. I came here to rid your kingdom of your bloodline and erase the shame of your birth. Bring me your men and your gods and I will feed them fire and black smoke for what you have done to me! Keoi! Go Yamai! Go La Pula! No nai. Babaya Makela!
Mirtuva. Celistekaja. Ja zažiju obliču.
I knew him as a man. I knew his weakness and his strength. But if you ask me, will we ever see his like again? I would say no.
Vidite Mirtuva!
I need you to help me put my armor on. One last time. And fetch my sword. Please. It's impossible. I told you, Ivor, you can't kill him. He's not a god. Neither are you.
And so it happened, as my saga will tell. The kings and queens, the jarls and earls of Norway, answered the summons of Bjorn Ironside and came to save their country. For he was truly the king of all Norway, and no one else could have united all his people and brought them to victory over the Rus.
Farewell, my brother.
gladdens me to know that Odin makes ready the benches for a feast. Soon, you'll be drinking ale from curved horns. Valkyrie summon you home.
Load the catapults. Infantry form up for advance. Archers ready.
Archers! Knock! Knock!
Atlas! 3 weeks from now, I will be harvesting my crops. Imagine where you will be, and it will be so. Hold the line! Stay with me! If you find yourself alone, riding in green fields with the sun on your face, do not be troubled, for you are in Elysium, and you're already dead! Brothers, what we do in life echoes in eternity.
We're watching The Punic Wars by Oversimplify. That's not the name of it. Yeah, it is. Oversimplified. The first Punic War by Oversimplified. I'm very excited.
Oh, Marcellus, you
He who conquers Constantinople will have the world.
Thank you, Pico, for the sub. How are you?
The Turks are no match for Justiniani, my lord.
Where are you, Pico?
There's still hope.
It's no good, Emperor.
Thank you, Pico 3. How are you, Yulu?
You know what awaits you outside those walls. Be not afraid. We are privileged to defend this city that Constantine the Great built from dust. We are the protectors that have kept the scourge of Islam from Europe for 1,000 years.
At Taco Lotto, my weekend was pretty chill. How about yours, Taco?
Augustus! Justinian! Constantine! They will be watching! Our beloved city is lost. Now make haste to go to the Marmara walls while there's time.
No, Majesty. There's a ship waiting for us in the harbor. We can still escape if we leave now.
I'm going to guard my friend. It is my duty. Save yourself.
You think I will leave your side?
I'm old and ignorant. Tell the world valiantly. We Romans fight here tonight.
He faced odds that none of us will ever face. And instead he said to his enemies, no.
In the wake of Varus's death, Asprenas and Tiberius had taken an overly cautious approach to the Rhine frontier, one that won them little glory at the ire of their men. The mutiny of 14 CE required that the ferocity of the legionnaires be turned away from the new emperor and into the unknown. At the head of that column was the young son of the man who had conquered Germania in the first place, the adopted son of Tiberius, and heir to the Principate, Germanicus Julius Caesar. Welcome to our latest video on the Julio-Claudian dynasty of Rome. in which Germanicus will rally his legions and push deeper into Germania in pursuit of Rome's greatest enemy, Arminius, the betrayer of Teutoburg. Do you know why thousands of people on YouTube and Patreon support us financially? Because they get history you won't find anywhere else. We release 3 new exclusive videos every week. Plus, they get perks like early access to all videos, voting rights on upcoming series and videos, access to our private Discord, our production schedule, and much more. Right now, 250 exclusive episodes are waiting for members and patrons, including from our series on the Eastern Front of World War II, Spanish War of Succession, the Punic Wars, the Pacific War, the Iberian Reconquista, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, the North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, Sicilian Wars between the Greeks and Carthaginians, and many others. By joining, you're not only unlocking rare content, you're also supporting the stories you love. Your help allows us to keep producing 3 free videos per week while paying our team competitive salaries and growing the channel. Join via the links in the description, the pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. Thanks for making this possible. Despite Tiberius's suspicions and his own bungling of the situation, Germanicus's loyalty in the mutiny of 14 CE had bought him a considerable amount of favor with the new princeps. However, the mutiny could quickly turn once more to attempted usurpation, and Germanicus has to redirect their attention through the winter months. To that end, 4 legions, totaling 12,000 men, 26 allied cohorts, and 8 cavalry alae were led across the Rhine to the frontier with the rebels, where a forward operating base was established. From there, the troops took a roundabout route into the territory of the nearby Marsi to maintain the element of surprise. When Germanicus's soldiers came down upon them, the attack coincided with a major autumnal feast, and the intoxicated Marsi were caught completely off guard. Tacitus notes the brutality of this assault, stating that Germanicus divided his army into 4 columns, ordering them to scorch a swatch of land 50 miles across, and kill every man, woman and child within it. Shocked at this brazen disruption of the peace, the Bructeri, Usipetes and Tabantes laid a trap for Germanicus in retaliation for the massacre of the Marsi on the route home to Gaul. However, Germanicus was aware of the ambush thanks to reliable sources and scouting parties. He reformed his army into a hollow square to protect the baggage train, with the auxilia and cavalry as foreguards and rearguards. When his men had entered the forest, the Germani set upon the auxiliary cohorts.
Hello.
When we left off, Yi had crushed the Japanese at the Battle of Myeongyang and was busy rebuilding the Korean Navy after their disastrous losses while he was being falsely accused.
How are you?
Now, just as he's beginning to coordinate with the Chinese Navy on how to prosecute the war, something major happens. Maybe the one event that can truly change the course of this war. Hideyoshi dies. 6 years and 4 months after the fateful Japanese landing on Korea, the man who started it all, the man who envisioned a vast Asian empire radiating out from Japan, died. This was a sea change. Hideyoshi had been holding the Japanese in Korea by sheer force of will. As soon as he died, the council of men who ran Japan in his stead all looked at one another and said, "Does anyone here actually want to keep fighting Korea? Okay, show of hands, who wants to stay in Korea? Nobody? All right then." With that, they agreed to pull the Japanese forces out of there as soon as they could negotiate a deal which would let them withdraw their forces safely. But the Koreans were not so eager for peace after seeing hundreds of thousands of their countrymen slaughtered during Hideyoshi's invasion. So Admiral Yi continued to coordinate with the Chinese forces to bottle up the Japanese in one of their last strongholds, the port of Suncheon. The Chinese army closed around the city on land, and the Korean and Chinese navies blockaded the port. Seeing the situation as hopeless, the Japanese commander decided the best option he had left was to try to bribe everybody. But
that's great.
The year is 1572, 26 years earlier. A 28-year-old man rides across an open plain. A group of military men stand quietly, observing. His horse stumbles. He's thrown. At first, everybody watching thinks he's dead. His leg is horribly bent, broken. But after a moment, he gets up, dragging one leg behind him, and pulls himself to a willow tree. He binds his leg with its branches, remounts his horse, and finishes the military examination.
We watched
He
your
fails
stream
the
last
exam
time.
anyway,
There
but
is
4 years
test.
later he'll be back. He'll pass, and so will begin the career of one of the most glorious admirals of all time. It's strange that this man even decided to join the military. Korea had known 200 years of relative peace, threatened only by the occasional raids from the Jurchen tribes on the northern border and pirate crews plying the nearby sea. The military was not a highly respected career choice for a man of noble birth.
Like
Taking
today
the
or
civil
yesterday.
service exams and joining the ranks of the Confucian court was a much better way to achieve power and success. And yet this man, Yi Sun-shin, though he was schooled in the Confucian texts, had dreamed of being a soldier since he was a little boy. And so at last, when he had passed the military
I'm
exam,
not sure.
he was appointed
Maybe
to a
last
desolate
week.
fort along the northern
At
border.
Fairy TV
While
question
most
to
of the
Memo.
border forts were pits of
Hello,
corruption,
Piccolo.
seen simply as a place to
Hey,
dump
Pico
individuals who
GA1
had fallen out of
Axis
favor with
breaking
the
it
court,
down.
Yi drilled his men rigorously and refortified his post, bringing it up to true readiness in case of an attack. One day, the provincial governor came by to inspect the post. This was a man all of the fort commanders dreaded,
Memo
known
is
for his
sleeping
harsh
now.
punishments
He'll ask
and
her
brutal
when she
discipline.
wakes up.
But when he came to Yi, he
Ask
simply
what?
said, well done, and moved on. Shortly thereafter,
At Fairy
Yi was
TV,
moved
ask
back
her,
to Seoul,
"How is
a
Fairy?"
sign of growing favor, and he was given a post at the military academy there, training new recruits. He was by all accounts rigorous, diligent, and incorruptible. And this was exactly the problem. At this time, the military academy was actually a tool for younger noble sons to jump up the ranks quickly,
Right.
and
He'll
for
ask her
courtiers to
first
channel
thing
their
in the
favorite
morning.
people into the cushiest assignments. And Yi was not cooperating. So, after a short
Squire
stay in
3
Seoul,
giggle.
he was booted back to a provincial assignment. By July, though, he had secured a position running a naval garrison and was rapidly rising up the ranks again. But here, too, he was
How
schemed
about you,
against by
Pico?
corrupt officials.
How is you
Many
doing?
attempts were made to have Yi removed, but each one he parried expertly until, one day, one of his previous superiors from the military academy,
I'm fine.
one who Yi
Heading
had
to bed
rebuked
now.
for corruption, was called to his province to do an inspection. Seeing an opportunity for revenge, the inspector wrote a report castigating Yi, saying he was completely negligent. When the report got to Seoul, Yi found himself dismissed from the military entirely. 4 months later, though, he was vindicated. Found innocent of the charges against him, he was returned to service, but demoted to the lowest possible officer grade. He might have languished at this menial post, but at last his diligence was finally rewarded when he was brought back to meaningful duty by none other than one of his former rivals. One of the fleet commanders who Yi had served under while maintaining the naval garrison had been transferred to the northern frontier, and knowing that
sleepy.
he'd need good, capable officers, he requested Yi be sent with him. Soon, though, it became clear that Yi was needed to garrison a fort on the Tumen River, which was one of the demarcation lines between Jurchen and Korean territory. Jurchen raiders roamed far south of the Korean border, looting and pillaging at will. Raids had nearly overrun the nearby frontier province, and so Yi took up the post. He drilled his troops until they were in top
You might
shape,
ask
and
Memo
knowing that
yourself
simply
in the
shoring
dream
up the
world, then
defenses
he-
wouldn't be enough, he laid his troops out for an ambush and then lured the raiders into Korean territory. He fell on them with a ferocity and a swiftness they had never seen in Korea. Within hours, the tribes were smashed and their power shattered. They would never again be such a threat to the province. But here too, Yi was stymied by a jealous superior, and while the court was jubilant about his success, the official record reads, although the court recognized Yi Sun-shin's
mic
meritorious
broken or
service
is
to
it
the
'cause
king,
Memo
it
is
nevertheless decided against awarding him a prize. Shortly after this, Yi's father died, and being deeply rooted in Confucian ideals, Yi retired home for 3 years in accordance with the traditional mourning period. When he at last returned to service, he was put in charge of transportation for the court, but a mere 16 days later, it was decided that Yi was needed too badly at the border, and once again he was sent north. He was to man a small island fortress. Undermanned, crumbling beyond disrepair,
'Cause
he
she's
once
sleeping.
again drilled its garrison, shored up its defenses, and week after week sent out a request to the district commander for reinforcements. Then, one morning, as the mists rolled in and most of the men were out harvesting rice because the military was in such a state that men on the border had to harvest
get
their own
pretty
food,
loud when
the
I have
Jurchen
my
attacked,
headphones on.
pouring out of the mist on horseback. Yi Sun-shin only had a dozen men to defend with. He and his handful of soldiers fought desperately, cutting their way to one group of captives and escaping with 50 people the Jurchen would have taken prisoner. But by this time, you know the story. In order to avoid blame, Yi's superior, a man named Yi Il, blamed the entire defeat on Yi Sun-shin. He had him brought back to the capital, tortured, and put on trial in an attempt to have him condemned so that Yi Il could avoid any of the blame. But Yi Sun-shin did not crack under torture, and when it came time to take the stand, he said this to Yi Il. My lord, you are asking me to assume the whole responsibility for the misfortune, but you are wrong. May I remind you that you have always refused my frequent request for reinforcement. The defeat was not a result of my negligence of duty, but in large part, your fault. Therefore, it is not I, but you, who should be held responsible for the defeat. The court was stunned. Many of them knew of Yi's record and were inclined to believe him, so in the end, he was allowed to live, but he was stripped of his rank, again, and returned to the army as a common enlisted man, starting over at the very bottom, as if he'd never taken the military examinations. He was once again placed on the northern border and asked to fight the invading tribes, and once again he did so with distinction, until finally in 1588 he asked that he be allowed to retire. But storm clouds were gathering over Korea, and some, especially his longtime friend, a man named Ryu Sung-young, recognized that soon the country would have need of good military men. While Yi had struggled through his career in the military, Ryu, his childhood compatriot, who had been his companion in games of war, had risen to be Prime Minister of Korea. It was actually through Ryu's influence, and because of his subtle aid, that Yi had time and again survived the machinations held against him. Now, Ryu planned to see that Yi would take his rightful place for the war he feared was coming. On the next episode of Extra History, remember how in the Sengoku Jidai episodes we talked about that messy Japanese invasion of Korea? Well, that's about to happen. Join us as Yi and Ryu take on the Japanese forces, as we delve into the differences in government, technology, and arms between these two nations, and as we explore the first few disastrous weeks of this war. At last, we've passed the phase of Yi's life where his every effort is thwarted by the machinations of corrupt officials and jealous superiors. Finally, we can begin the story that sees Yi rise to be the national hero of Korea. But first, we have to talk about the two contrasting states that are about to meet in bloody battle. If you watched the Sengoku Jidai episodes, you'll remember that Japan had just come out of 100 years of ceaseless war. Their entire society was built off of a martial hierarchy, where the most glorious thing a man could do was fight. Japan had fielded giant armies and had an economy devoted to war. They had hundreds of thousands of veteran soldiers, and they had seasoned generals, battle-hardened from years of campaigning. And now, for the first time ever, all those forces were unified under one man, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. The Korean state had, by contrast, been mostly at peace for 200 years. The state itself was a Confucian bureaucracy, which should have meant that it was an enlightened meritocracy, but in truth, the Korean government was rotten to its core, full of factional infighting and led by a king who perhaps might have been a great leader in times of peace, but was utterly unsuited for a state of war. In terms of military thinking, the Japanese had spent years perfecting the art of war. The daimyos had become early adopters of the arquebus, and had rapidly innovated on firearm manufacturing and tactics. They had created movable field works to protect their gunners, coordinated the use of spears and arquebusiers, drilled the men to release large, simultaneous volleys to break up a charge, and trained them to wait to fire until they were within an effective range. They were such enthusiastic adopters of the arquebus that when the Japanese eventually arrived on Korean shores, about a quarter of their total force would be armed with this fearsome weapon. The Japanese had also become masters of the siege after so many decades of having to topple the highly wrought, master-crafted Japanese castles of the Sengoku age. The Koreans, on the other hand, had largely ignored the introduction of personal firearms, and still relied mainly on the bow. But because the bow is a weapon that requires a great deal of training, and the Korean military was in a dissipated state, the actual number of effective troops they could field with this weapon was now very limited. The lists of who they could call to military service were all out of date, and so the initial mustering of forces would lag behind, and Korean defensive works were mostly just simple stone walls atop hills or mountains. But the Koreans did have two advantages. Since the war that had been burning through Japan for the last 100 years was a civil war, and thus mostly land-based, Japan hadn't built up its navy nearly as much as their other armed forces. Additionally, while Japan produced vastly superior handguns, the Koreans had developed better naval cannon. And this all makes sense when you think about what both of these forces were used to facing. Japanese forces were used to fighting large, organized land armies, and so they'd focused on developing the weapons and techniques required to counter them, whereas Korea had mostly dealt with pirates and raiders, so they'd built cannon to help defend their coast, and they'd built simple hill forts so that when raiders showed up, the people could hide in the forts and simply wait for the raiders to go away. They didn't need complex structures because the enemy Korea usually faced wasn't an enemy bent on conquest, but that was about to change. Between 1587 and 1592, emissaries raced back and forth between Japan and Korea. Hideyoshi wanted the Koreans to just let him march his armies through their lands in order to attack his intended target, China. But besides the fact that letting giant foreign armies march across your country is generally a bad idea, the Koreans also happened to be tributary allies of the Chinese with strong cultural and economic ties, so letting this army march through uncontested was out of the question. This whole thing seemed like madness to them. The idea that the Japanese would even ask for such a thing was unfathomable to many in court. At first, they assumed the request must be a bluff, maybe a negotiating tactic that would eventually end in the Japanese asking for trade concessions or tribute or something. But Ryu Song-yang saw further, to what was really about to go down. And so he got Yi a naval appointment in the southwestern part of Korea, and helped to make sure that he rose rapidly through the ranks, becoming the naval commander for the province by 1591. This is where Yi's story really begins. Upon taking command, Yi saw the dire straits the Navy was in and knew he had little time. He began drilling his men and instilling in them the spirit they needed for the war to come. He commissioned a new type of ship, the famous turtle ship, which he helped design. It was a remarkable piece of naval technology, with a spiked roof to keep enemy boarding parties out and a dragon head prow that could serve as a cannon or billow out noxious smoke. But even before the first of these ships could see active service, it happened. Sentries all across the southeast coast began to spot ships coming over the horizon. Then tens of ships. Then hundreds. This massive fleet flew no sails known to Korean arms. Fires were lit and word was spread. The Japanese were coming. But the local commanders refused to believe what they were seeing. They suggested that maybe it was a trade fleet, or maybe even a large tribute mission from the Japanese to apologize for how rude their ambassadors had been. And so, the local commanders did nothing. The approaching ships began to dock at Busan. Soldiers, fully armored and prepared for war, began to disembark from the ships, and still the local commanders did nothing. By nightfall, 300 ships full of warriors had landed. A Japanese army was now in Korea. Finally, the commanders realized what had just happened, but by now it was far too late. With well over 100 heavy Korean ships of war at the ready, they had just sat and watched this happen without even moving a single one of those ships out to scout the fleet. If they had, they would have found out that this was a Japanese commander acting against orders. Eager to be the first to Korea, he had sailed his fleet before their warship arrived. Turns out nearly all of those hundreds of ships were unarmed transports. No match for the Korean Navy, which still sat anchored at port doing nothing. The Japanese force moved like lightning, smashing army after army, crushing all in their way. Within the month, the Japanese were already in Seoul, 200 miles inland. Korean resistance had collapsed. And as the Japanese had pushed inland and moved out of Busan, the local commanders had scuttled their fleets. 100 Korean warships lost without a fight. But Busan's local commanders had sent word to Yi, asking for his help. So Yi set out with all 24 ships under his command, writing to other local commanders and telling them to rendezvous with him at sea. He left under cover of darkness and sailed through the night so his movements wouldn't be observed. By the time the various fleets met, they'd scraped together 45 warships and a handful of commandeered fishing ships. But Yi, despite never having commanded a battle at sea before, had a plan. He would fall on the Japanese while they were in harbor during the chaos of a sack. He found 50 of their vessels tied up at Okpo and descended upon them. The Japanese were mostly away from their ships at the time, looting and slaughtering the population. The roar of cannon alerted them to their mistake. Yi and his fleet tore through the enemy ships, salvo after salvo ripping into the light wood of the Japanese vessels. The Japanese tried to mount a defense, but to no avail. Soon their men were throwing their weapons and armor overboard and trying to swim for the shore. By nightfall, 26 Japanese ships rested at the bottom of the harbor. Only one Korean sailor was injured. Yi decided to disappear back into open water before his forces fell into the same trap he'd just sprung on his enemy. But as they sailed, one of his outlying ships spotted 5 more Japanese warships. Yi fell upon them with a vengeance. Only one managed to escape. Then new reports came in of 13 more ships near Chinhae. When the sailors on those ships saw Yi, they abandoned their vessels entirely and fled on foot into the mountains. 43 Japanese ships sunk, and Yi had not lost a single vessel. He was promoted to general command of the Southern Navy for his actions, but the sight of Japanese slaughtering civilians would stick with him forever and harden his resolve to defend the people of Korea. Join us next time as everyone else in Korea keeps losing, and Admiral Yi keeps winning. The king had fled from Seoul. The court was making the arduous trek to Pyongyang. Half of Korea was already in Japanese hands. Yi Il, the very same man who had once tried to pass his negligence off to Yi Sun-shin, was the commander of the Korean army. His forces were routed in battle after battle. Essential fortifications and choke points were abandoned, surrendered with barely a fight. Then, in the Battle of Cheongju, the regular Korean forces, under the command of a man named Shin Rip, were annihilated. This is the moment that forces the king to abandon his capital. This is the moment that leads many to fear that Korea as a nation may not survive. But on the very same day that the king fled from his seat, Admiral Yi was destroying the Japanese fleet in Okpo Harbor. Hope for the nation lived in a handful of ships plying the coast. For 3 weeks after Okpo, Yi gathered charts, scouted out the enemy fleet, and waited for his secret weapon, the turtle ship, to arrive. Then his spies reported to him that the Japanese were anchored at Sachun. This was too near his personal headquarters for comfort, so it was time he tested out the turtle ship. It was time he drove them off. But when his tiny fleet of 26 ships arrived outside Sachun, he saw that the Japanese arquebusiers had taken up positions along the cliffs above the harbor. If he were to attack, they could pour down fire on his ships. He pondered this for a moment. Then he sent a small detachment to sail within sight of the Japanese fleet. Once they were sure the Japanese had spotted them, they turned and fled, and the Japanese gave chase. But the retreat was feigned. As soon as the Japanese fleet entered open water, Yi fell upon them with his entire force. His turtle ship plowed into the middle of the Japanese armada. Cannon fire rang out from all sides. Ships splintered and burned in the setting sun. The Japanese tried to close in, but they couldn't manage to board the covered turtle ship. With the Korean warships surrounding them and the turtle ship in their midst, the Japanese fought a hopeless battle until all 13 of the ships that had pursued the Koreans to open water were at the bottom of the sea. Not a single Korean vessel was lost. After the battle, as his commanders gathered for a debriefing, Yi loosed his coat, pulled out a sword, and dug out a bullet that had lodged in his shoulder. His sub-commanders were amazed. To maintain morale, Yi had let no one know that he'd been injured in the fight. But as they all sat dumbfounded, Yi simply began to brief them on what to do in case of a counterattack. The next day, local fishermen reported to Yi that the Japanese were anchored at Dangpo, and that their men were sacking the city. Yi ordered his fleet to move with all haste. He would not let another Japanese slaughter go unanswered. When they reached the harbor city of Dangpo, he once again smashed through the enemy line with his turtle ship, positioned it right next to the enemy flagship, and buried shot after shot in its side. With his turtle ship in their midst, the enemy couldn't maneuver, and because the turtle ship had heavy guns on all sides, it couldn't be flanked. It simply loosed salvo after salvo at everything around it. And while the turtle ship caused chaos, the rest of the Korean ships surrounded the Japanese and trapped them in the harbor. At the height of the battle, one of Yi Sun-shin's sub-commanders, Kwon Jun, stood upon the deck of his vessel, drew his bow, and loosed an arrow at the enemy admiral. The shot found its mark. 2 of his men then leapt upon the enemy flagship and cut off the Japanese admiral's head. Seeing their commander's head held aloft, the Japanese were thrown into a panic. Command broke down, and in the chaos, Yi's ships sank the Japanese vessels one by one. As night fell and the Koreans withdrew, not a single Japanese ship remained. 2 days later, another Korean fleet, a fleet that was supposed to have joined them before any of this began but ran behind, finally rendezvoused with Yi, bringing his squadron up to 51 ships in total. With this larger force, he began to chase down rumors of another anchored Japanese fleet sacking a Korean town. The rumor turned out to be true, and again, Yi pounced upon the Japanese while they were disorganized, plundering a town. Again, Yi sent his turtle ship into their midst, and again, he used a feigned retreat to lure them out into open water, although this time he did it to keep the Japanese from fleeing to shore if they were defeated. Again they followed, and again, upon his signal, his fleet turned upon their pursuers. Again the Japanese admiral fell in the battle, and Japanese morale broke. Again, the Koreans trapped the fleeing vessels, and again, the Japanese fleet, 26 ships in all, was destroyed without a single loss for Yi's forces. Turtle Ship was OP. Upon hearing of all this, Hideyoshi was furious. He was so close to conquering Korea. His men had taken Pyongyang. The Korean court had been driven all the way to a tiny border village. Any further and the King of Korea wouldn't even be on Korean soil anymore. There was only one province he had not yet been able to overrun, Chola, where Yi was based. And without control of the sea, he couldn't resupply his massive army in the field. Yi must be destroyed. The order was given. There would be no more land raids from his navy until Yi's fleet was at the bottom of the Tsushima Strait. He ordered his admirals to pool their forces and to form a massive fleet to sweep aside this admiral that was causing him so much pain. The three main Japanese admirals were to gather their fleets in Busan, but the admiral with the largest fleet, Wakisaka Yasuharu, decided that bringing the fleets together was taking too long. Side note, if you watched our Sengoku Jidai series, this is one of the men who would eventually betray Ishida at the Battle of Sekigahara. Anyway, eager for glory and unwilling to wait for the rest of the Japanese forces, he set out with his 73 ships. I mean, why wait? He had 73 of the best ships in the Japanese fleet, and he knew Yi's armada, however devastating they might have been so far, was a small force. But Yi hadn't been idle after his last battle. He'd been drilling his men in new tactics and constructing additional ships. With these new additions, his fleet now numbered 56, and most importantly, with 2 new turtle ships he could bring to bear. On July 7th, 1592, a local farmer came to tell Yi that he had seen a huge Japanese armada, at least 70 ships strong, in the Kyonerang Strait. Yi had his fleet there by the next day. Knowing that he couldn't maneuver in the strait, Yi sent out 6 of his ships to lure the Japanese, and sure enough, the entire Japanese force followed at all haste. But this time, the Japanese faced yet another surprise. This technique of luring out the Japanese had been working so well that Yi had trained his men in a special formation called the Crane's Wing, where they would form a U around the enemy vessels that chased his ships, compressing them from all sides, making them easy targets, and leaving them no room to maneuver. The Crane's Wing descended. The sound of cannon fire ripped the air. One of the largest naval battles in world history raged for hours. But when the smoke cleared, 47 of the Japanese ships were sunk and 12 were captured. Only 14 of them escaped to the harbor at Busan, and still, not a single Korean ship was lost. The next day, Yi was informed of the location of the other 2 admirals' fleets. They were anchored together at Angulpo. Yi saw the opportunity for a decisive blow, and so he set his vessels fresh off the last battle towards another attack. This time, though, no matter what he tried, the Japanese refused to be lured out of their position, so Yi sent his ships in small assault squads, using their superior range to hammer the largest of the Japanese ships, then moving clear so another squad could circle in and fire. The battle was long and bloody. Though still none of Yi's ships were sunk, between the action outside of Kyonerang and the Battle of Angulpo, hundreds of his sailors were wounded. It was the most damage the Japanese had done to Yi's fleet to date. But the majority of the Japanese fleet in the harbor was destroyed. Only a few ships remained, and these Yi ordered not to be touched, because many of the Japanese soldiers had fled to the nearby shore, and, as he said, many brigands escaped into the mountains where local inhabitants have taken refuge. If all the Japanese ships were to be burned, the brigands would massacre Korean citizens in revenge. As he expected, instead of slaughtering the peasants in the hills, the Japanese boarded their remaining boats and slipped away in the night. 6 days later, upon hearing the news of these calamitous defeats, Hideyoshi ordered all offensive naval operations to cease. From now on, the Japanese Navy would only guard the passage to Busan. And so, with one stroke, Yi destroyed all of Hideyoshi's hopes for invading China. And without being able to resupply from the sea, even the Japanese efforts on the Korean peninsula were in jeopardy. The supply lines to the forces occupying Pyongyang were sorely stretched, and pursuing the Korean court any further became effectively impossible. Though the Korean army had been beaten on land time and time again, Yi had saved Korea. But the war wasn't over. Join us next time for Yi's attempt to land a finishing blow, treachery, and perhaps the greatest last stand in naval history. Last time, we left Yi storming through the waters south of Korea, savaging the Japanese fleet wherever he went. He had driven them first to consolidate their forces to try to thwart him, and then, finally, to give up on offensive naval operations entirely, restricting their fleets to just defending the vital supplies coming in at Busan. Now it was in this last harbor that Yi would attack them. In the 2 months since the Battle of Angulpo, Yi had trained his men, reinforced his fleet, and tried to rationalize the structure of Korean Naval Command. Now, on September 1st, 1592, he was ready to take on the combined Japanese armada at Busan. His fleet of 166 ships set out to destroy the nearly 500 Japanese ships awaiting them in Busan Bay. He caught a few stragglers along the way, but the Japanese had finally learned from their past encounters with him. They were holed up in the harbor now, and while Yi's ships were able to fire into the harbor from outside Japanese cannon range, he couldn't find an opening to get close enough to achieve the type of complete victory he craved. As long as the Japanese were in that harbor, they were protected by the surrounding troops and cannon on the shore. By the end of the day, Yi's fleet had destroyed 130 ships, and the Japanese hadn't sunk a single vessel, but the Japanese forces still held the all-important harbor of Busan. Yi had not been able to break their last line of supply. Now they'd be able to re-entrench and reinforce the harbor. As winter set in and the campaign season slowed down, the situation on the ground changed as well. An army from China had finally arrived in the north, and by January they had driven the Japanese out of Pyongyang. All over the country, the Japanese started to fall back, unable to sustain their lengthy lines of supply due to Yi's bottling up of their navy. By April, Seoul was retaken as well, and Busan served as the last great Japanese stronghold, anchoring their control on southern Korea. By August, Yi was promoted to Supreme Commander of the Korean Army and moved his base to the island of Honsando, where he had previously used his crane wing formation to crush the Japanese offensive fleet. Again and again, Yi petitioned the court for Marines so that he could resume naval operations, because his fleet couldn't attack the Japanese so long as they stayed defended under their shore guns, and without Marines, he couldn't dislodge the shore batteries in order to follow up with the naval attack. But the Korean army was still in disarray at this point. Some of the most significant military gains on land were actually being made by guerrilla forces and the righteous armies of Buddhist monks, and what little of the regular army there was not already deployed on the main offensive with the Chinese was simply not up to the task Yi needed. And so his fleet sat, patrolled the waters, and kept the Japanese from breaking out of Busan. They would not get to engage in another major battle for some time. So instead, Yi focused on turning his island base into a production center. With the country ravaged by war and most of the working-age men conscripted into the army or the navy, the central government couldn't provide Yi's forces with the food, lumber, or weapons he needed to keep his men fed and his fleet in top shape. So he invited refugees to come to his island. He would protect them if they would work the land. At first they were just producing grain, but soon they were harvesting salt and timber. Then the production facilities grew to handle boat building and uniform manufacturing. Soon there was a full-fledged R&D wing on the island, and great forges to produce goods of iron. The first truly successful Korean muskets were forged here by Yi's research team. But as Yi was making his navy self-sufficient, the land war in Korea slowly ground to a stalemate, and peace talks began. The talks wore on for 3.5 years, until in September 1596, negotiations broke down, and Hideyoshi prepared a second invading force of 141,500 men to head to the shores of Korea. As this new invasion force was setting sail, the Korean court received a letter from one of the Japanese commanders, in which he appeared to be selling out one of his counterparts, telling the Koreans exactly where his hated rival's fleet would be sailing, and suggesting that if only Admiral Yi Sun-shin would sail there, he could wipe them out and do everybody a favor. Now, Admiral Yi heard this and laughed. Yeah, nice try. He refused the order to sail his fleet into an obvious Japanese trap. But Yi's childhood friend, Ryu Sung-young, had enemies in court, and when they heard of Yi's refusal to follow orders, they seized on this opportunity and had Yi tried for treason. Ryu could do nothing to save him. Yi was ordered to return to Seoul for his punishment. His replacement as head of the navy would be Won Kyun. This was the guy who'd sat and done nothing when the Japanese ships first invaded, and then promptly scuttled his own fleet. A fleet 4 times as large as the one Yi had been using to inflict such heavy losses on their enemies. Yi was nearly sentenced to death for his insubordination, but there were still those in court who saw his value, and though they couldn't save him entirely, they did save his life. He was once more reduced to the rank of a common soldier and sent off to fight with one of the armies. But not long after he arrived at the army, the Japanese tried the same trick again. They sent the court a letter, this time informing them of a large transport fleet that was on its way, and saying how easy it would be to pick off these transports if they hurried. Won Kyon was ordered to intercept this juicy target, and he immediately set sail with every ship Yi had built. But when he reached the waters near Busan, he was shocked to find not an unarmed transport convoy, but a massive war fleet of 500 ships. Despite this, and the exhaustion his men faced from traveling so quickly, Won Kyon ordered a head-on assault. The winds picked up, and a gale began to form. Won Kyon couldn't keep his fleet together. Soon, some 30 Korean ships were burning, having drifted close enough to the enemy that, for the first time in the war, the Japanese could deploy their preferred form of naval warfare, boarding parties. In a panic, Won Kyon ordered a retreat and fled to the island of Kadokdo, where he ordered his men off the ships to resupply. What he hadn't realized was that this island was under Japanese control. As his men searched for fresh water, they were set upon by the Japanese island garrison and slaughtered. Those who escaped fled back to the ships without any of the supplies they desperately needed. Then the fleet just sat there, deflated and listless. Commanders asked for orders, but Won Kyon had none. Though Busan itself was not far away, he didn't even send out scouts or reposition his fleet. Then, on the night of July 15th, guided by a full moon, the Japanese struck. Won Kyon's forces were in a disadvantageous position. His men were fatigued from lack of supply and demoralized by their loss and the days of waiting. Caught off guard at night and without any sort of plan, they were no match for the organized and coordinated Japanese assault. Even abandoning ship couldn't save them, as those that made it to one of the nearby shores found themselves face to face with the Japanese army, who were silently waiting there for any stragglers who might try to escape, and were quickly cut down. Of the fleet Yi had so carefully built, only 12 ships escaped, saved by one of the sub-commanders who had tried to warn Won Kyon of the danger they faced. 157 Korean ships were lost that day, including every turtle ship ever built. So with only 12 ships left in the entire navy, who did Korea call upon? Who else? But mere days after reinstating Yi as admiral, the court informed him that they were disbanding the navy. Yi responded thusly: "This humble subject still has 12 ships. However small the number may be, I solemnly swear I will be able to defend the sea if I prepare myself for death to resist the enemy." And so, they let him. So Yi plotted and pondered where he would make his last stand. This would be it. This one decision would seal the fate of Korea. He studied charts and tides, and finally came to decide on Myeongyang, the Roaring Strait. This particular strait had a strong current, but unknown to the Japanese, its current had a strange property. Every 3 hours, it changed direction. It was upon this unusual current that Yi would gamble everything. On September 16th, the Japanese fleet, looking to destroy the final remnant of the Korean Navy, found Yi's scouts at the mouth of the strait. They chased the scouts into the strait, and that's when Yi fell upon them. Yi's flagship dashed into their midst, roaring cannon and tearing through Japanese timber. But his ship fought alone. The rest of his navy, possessed by fear at facing such a large force, had lagged behind. Eventually, though, seeing the havoc Yi's ship was wreaking on the enemy, they took heart. Messengers were sent from boat to boat with a mix of inspirational words, threats, and the hope of victory. And soon, the rest of Yi's tiny armada dove into the fray. Then, a stroke of luck. The enemy flagship was blown apart by friendly fire, and the Japanese began to waver. Some of their ships began to turn about to fall back, and it was just at this moment that the water's current turned. The strait was too narrow for all the Japanese ships to maneuver around each other, and with the current roaring against them, ship slammed into ship. They tried in vain to retreat, tangled, ships smashing into one another, screams and chaos, and over it all, the roaring water. With the current now on their side, the Koreans gave chase, laying into enemy ships on either side, a hail of fire and arrows. The Japanese boats burnt and sank. 133 vessels had come to crush this tiny remnant of Korean Navy, and 31 of them wouldn't be returning. Yi, even when facing odds of 10 to 1, had once again not lost a single ship. Word of Yi's victory spread. As his tiny fleet sailed, one by one other ships began to show up, ships that had been thought lost, ships that had been hiding after the previous disaster under Won Kyon. These ships now came to join Yi's tiny armada. Refugees flocked to where Yi's ships were anchored, willingly giving him food, cloth, and iron. And perhaps most importantly, the Chinese, who had mostly limited their naval efforts to guarding ports until now, decided that they could work with the Korean Navy and take the offensive. And so we'll leave Yi rebuilding the Korean Navy until next week, when we see the Japanese invasion ended for good. When we left off, Yi had crushed the Japanese at the Battle of Myeongyang and was busy rebuilding the Korean Navy after their disastrous losses while he was being falsely accused. Now, just as he's beginning to coordinate with the Chinese Navy on how to prosecute the war, something major happens. Maybe the one event that can truly change the course of this war. Hideyoshi dies. 6 years and 4 months after the fateful Japanese landing on Korea, the man who started it all, the man who envisioned a vast Asian empire radiating out from Japan, died. This was a sea change. Hideyoshi had been holding the Japanese in Korea by sheer force of will. As soon as he died, the council of men who ran Japan in his stead all looked at one another and said, "Does anyone here actually want to keep fighting Korea? Okay, show of hands, who wants to stay in Korea?" Nobody? All right then. With that, they agreed to pull the Japanese forces out of there as soon as they could negotiate a deal which would let them withdraw their forces safely. But the Koreans were not so eager for peace after seeing hundreds of thousands of their countrymen slaughtered during Hideyoshi's invasion. So Admiral Yi continued to coordinate with the Chinese forces to bottle up the Japanese in one of their last strongholds, the port of Suncheon. The Chinese army closed around the city on land, and the Korean and Chinese navies blockaded the port. Seeing the situation as hopeless, the Japanese commander decided the best option he had left was to try to bribe everybody. But each time it seemed as though he was succeeding in bribing the Chinese contingents, Yi shamed them into falling back in line. Seeing no hope of peaceful retreat, the Japanese commander had one last plan. He dispatched a messenger boat to slip through the Chinese lines and tell the other major Japanese garrison to deploy all their ships and rendezvous with him as they tried to break their way through the Chinese and Korean blockade. But Yi got word of this plan and knew that he must prepare. The next night, November 15th, 1598, long after the sun had fallen below the horizon and the water had faded from blue to deep black, Yi told his forces to slip away from the blockade. They would try to intercept the reinforcing fleet in the fateful Noryang Strait. Near 2 a.m., the joint Korean and Chinese fleet fell upon the resting Japanese ships. At first it was chaos, cannon lighting up the water at night, but soon the Japanese tried to regroup. Despite being caught off guard, they still had 500 ships to the combined 150 of Yi and the Chinese, and moreover, they were fueled by desperation. If they lost here, who knows if they'd ever see Japan again? But the Allied forces had two advantages going for them as well. For one, they had once again caught the Japanese in a strait where they could not easily maneuver their massive fleet, and two, even if they could maneuver, many of their ships were transports, which were only useful for boarding and arquebus fire in a fight. In desperation, the Japanese attacked, driving their ships through the withering hail of the enemy cannonade. Unfortunately for Yi, the Chinese commander, who wasn't used to fighting the Japanese and had no experience with Yi's long-range form of naval warfare, charged forward to meet the Japanese fleet and prepared to engage them in hand-to-hand combat. The Chinese commander was surrounded. Dozens of Japanese ships descended on the Chinese flagship. Yi ordered his own ship to attempt a rescue. Yi's flagship plunged into the midst of the enemy. He was committed now. It would be fierce, close combat the rest of the way. Exactly the type of fight Yi had always tried to avoid. The vessels were so close that unarmed Korean sailors began throwing bundles of burning sticks down on the enemy decks. As Yi's ship broke through the waves, he spotted 3 of the enemy's admirals standing on the deck of one of the Japanese ships attacking his ally. And so, Yi drew his bow and loosed. One of the admirals fell. For a moment there was almost a silence in the midst of the fighting, as everybody looked to see where that arrow had come from. Then one of the Japanese admirals roused himself from his shock and shouted that it was Yi. All the ships must attack Yi. All the Japanese vessels turned and began to give chase to Yi's flagship. But now it was the Chinese admiral's turn to take action, and his ships tore into the vessels pursuing Yi. Soon the fight was on the deck of the Chinese flagship, Chinese Dao sparking against Japanese katana. In the end, the Japanese boarding parties were repelled, but many from both sides lay dead on the deck. As dawn began to bring light back to the scene, everyone could see how badly the Japanese were faring. They attempted to flee, but Yi would have none of it. These people who had come to his land, who had despoiled his home, who had slaughtered his people and endangered his nation, no, he would not let them flee. He grabbed the mallet from the ship's drummer and began to beat the war drum himself, urging his ships to go ever faster. The haunting echo of the drum pushed the fleet on. Its beat hounded the Japanese, bit at their heels. His fleet moved like it never had before, the drum steadily beating like the call of the god of war. They were upon the Japanese. Cannons roared, arquebuses answered. Shouts and screams were heard as ship after ship was caught by the pursuing fleet, possessed by the beat of the drums of war. But then, just for an instant, the drums faltered. Seen by no one but his son, his nephew, and a loyal servant, Yi had been struck by a stray arquebus ball. They rushed to his side as he slumped against the drum, trying to aid him, asking if there was anything they could do. With his last breath, he said to them, "We are about to win this war. Keep beating the drum. Do not let anyone know of my death." His son picked up the mallet and continued the beat. Dressed in Yi's armor, his son and his nephew took up the command. For hours, they were Yi, commanding as he would, with all his ability and skill. None of Yi's officers ever realized he had fallen until, as the battle was closing, the Chinese flagship was once again surrounded. Yi's son ordered his ship into the thick. They darted forward, breaking the cordon around the Chinese flagship, helping the Chinese to escape. The fighting was fierce, but it was near the last of it. And as the day closed, the Chinese admiral sailed toward Yi's flagship and called out to thank Yi for saving him, to invite Yi to celebrate the glorious day together. But he was met by Yi's son. Instantly, he knew what had happened, and 3 times he threw himself to the deck, wailing and crying out, "Even after death, you saved my life." This was the last battle of the war. 300 Japanese ships were destroyed or captured. After this, the remaining Japanese garrisons would either be captured one by the Chinese and Korean forces, or slip back to Japan to fight one last struggle before Tokugawa's ascension as shogun. At last, the Imjin War was at an end. Hideyoshi's dream of a Japanese empire was broken. Korea was free, but Yi would never see it. Thousands turned out to see his body returned to his small home village. People lined the road and wailed at the passing of a man they may never have met. The Chinese admiral wrote for him a eulogy, and even the court and the king tried to make their recompense. And so passed the man so ill-treated in life, so often demoted and accused, the man who would forever be known as the martial lord of loyalty.
Hello everyone, welcome to Lies, the part of Extra History where I get to
July 1st, 1392. King Charles VI is riding at the head of his army, and the leper has been following them for a half hour. "Turn back, noble king," the leper shouts. "You are betrayed." Those words again and again. As the minutes pass, Charles begins to sweat. Is he in danger? This whole expedition is to punish a man who'd tried to assassinate his best friend. He eyes his courtiers. He feels them watching him, but when he looks, they look away. It is so hot. A page, drowsy from the long ride, drops a lance. It clangs when it hits the ground. "Traitors!" Charles shouts, drawing his blade. He rushes forward, hacking at his retinue. Stunned and unwilling to draw swords on their most Christian king, all the courtiers can do is wrestle him out of the saddle. But by the time they pin him to the ground, 5 men are dead. Charles stops struggling. His eyes roll back in coma. The courtiers exchange looks. The king is in the grip of madness, and soon France will follow him. Before the miracles began, before the siege of Orleans, before the saints appeared to a peasant girl, France was a country cursed by God. And that began with King Charles the Beloved, or as he became known, Charles the Mad. Because that first psychotic episode would not be the last for the French king. At times he was perfectly lucid, able to rule as he used to, but then he would slip, failing to recognize friends and family, not understanding that he was the King of France, instead insisting he was St. George, or wearing thick clothes with iron bands sewn in because he thought he was made of glass. and might shatter if touched. And on occasion, he would run wild through the halls of his residence. Court officials had to brick up entrances to keep him inside. With Charles incapacitated and often confined, rule fell to a council of regents overseen by Queen Isabeau. And this wasn't actually the worst time for France. There had been a truce in the 100 Years' War, and the country was at peace. People were thinking about taxes, not armies. Because here's the thing, while Charles was unable to rule consistently, he wasn't dead. The crown hadn't passed to his sons. It was all about the council, and as councils will do, this one split into factions. Particularly as the older generation of council members died, leaving their seats to their children. Two main groups emerged, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, both led by men of the royal bloodline. The Armagnacs were led by the king's younger brother Louis, Duke of Orleans, powerful, rich, and famous for his voracious pursuit of women. He was extremely close to the queen, suspiciously close, some said, even whispering that her third son Charles was actually fathered by Louis. Economically, they wanted France to remain the traditional agricultural country that it was. On the other side were the Burgundians, led by the king's cousin, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. The Burgundians held large parts of northeast France, where there was heavy English influence due to the invasions of the 100 Years' War, and they were tied economically to Britain via the textile trade. So perhaps, not surprisingly, they were interested in developing France along an English model with strong cities and increased emphasis on pasture land and sheep farming. They also supported different popes. Yeah, there were like 3 popes running around at this time. It's a long story, we won't get into it. But their issues weren't all ideological. Other things that came between them were very, very personal. Rumor had it that Louis had tried to seduce John's wife. But the gist of the whole thing is that a decade into the council's existence, these factions were locked in a struggle to control the throne. Relations between the factions had been curdling for years, when Louis of Orleans, leveraging his close relationship with the queen, started minimizing Burgundian influence on the council, while also buying up land in the Burgundian sphere of influence. This also meant diverting royal gifts from John to himself, until Louis had an annual income 5 times larger than his rival. John the Fearless responded by adopting populist policies, whipping up the commoners and merchants by promising to abolish taxes that, he said, did nothing but pay for the extravagant court life. With tensions escalating, the two sides kidnapped members of the royal family, including the Dauphin, the crown prince, back and forth. Finally, they openly threatened violence. Everyone needed to cool down, the court decided. So on November 20th, 1407, the two parties reconciled in a court ceremony. But as they made their vows, a hit squad living in a rented house talked through their plans, sharpened their weapons, and bought masks. 3 days later, a shoemaker's wife looked out her window and saw Louis of Orleans leaving the queen's residence, a song on his lips. She looked away, heard shouts, and looked back. She saw Louis pulled from the saddle, thrown to his knees, surrounded by men with swords and axes. They struck him again and again, beating him like a mattress, until a man in a red hood told them to scatter. The attack was so brutal that they had to scoop bits of Louis into his coffin. His severed hand, which he'd raised to defend himself, became a symbol of Burgundian savagery. And John the Fearless owned it, arguing that he'd ordered the killing for the good of the crown in order to remove an evil and corrupt tyrant who defiled the queen and plotted to murder the king with necromancy. Charles, reportedly in a bout of mental illness, pardoned John and called for a truce. A year later, the factions were embroiled in a civil war. For a decade, the fighting would start and stop, with truces called and broken on an almost annual basis. And this civil conflict reached unheard of levels of viciousness. Soldiers scoured the country, sacking villages and looting everything, even the clothes off of the backs of slaughtered peasants. Paris changed hands multiple times, with poor Queen Isabeau having to hop between factions in order to protect the inheritance of her rapidly diminishing stock of sons. The Dauphins of France seemed to be cursed, with one dying of disease every few years. And then, disaster struck. Seeing his opening, Henry V invaded the divided France in 1415, as can be seen in our History of England series. But his campaign quickly bogged down, and an Armagnac force caught him as he was trying to march to the safety of an English-held city. The Armagnacs had more men, and the English were exhausted, demoralized and riddled with disease. But there was the mud and the rain of arrows. The French knights were heavily armored, but their horses were not. And by the time the armored Armagnac forces slogged into the battle line, they were so exhausted they could barely lift their weapons. Men who fell, drowned in the sucking earth. The flower of French nobility, 3 dukes, 6 counts, and 90 other nobles died in a single day. Many others were captured. But for France, the disaster continued when the Burgundians, seeing an opportunity, broke the fragile truce and made a grab for Paris. Instead of uniting, the factions played the blame game. The Burgundians argued that the Armagnacs had lost a crucial battle, and the Armagnacs claimed they would have won if the Burgundians had bothered to show up. The civil war continued, and the English advanced, with the Burgundians often standing to the side, an English ally in all but name. Soon, there were 2 Frances, with 2 capitals. Every level of society, from the plowmen in the fields to the academics in Paris, chose sides. And as France split, the royal family did too. Though originally an Armagnac, Queen Isabeau defected to the Burgundians after her former allies imprisoned her. But her surviving son, Charles VII, now Dauphin, despite rumors of illegitimacy, was literally married to the Armagnacs. His mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, was a major string puller in the Armagnac faction. So when Isabeau ceded her powers as regent to John the Fearless, and the 2 combined forces to drive the Armagnacs out of Paris, they were also driving out her son and heir. He had to flee amid the monumental slaughter of the city's fall. The Burgundians held the capital and the king and queen. The Armagnacs held their heir. This could not continue, it was decided. The Dauphin invited John the Fearless to peace talks. The initial approaches in July of 1419 went well, and the 2 agreed to meet on a bridge that September in order to hash out a final settlement, in order to end the Civil War. The confrontation was tense. John knelt. The Dauphin rebuffed him. Then something happened. Perhaps John put a hand on his sword as a mark of respect, or perhaps the Dauphin's Armagnac attendants just claimed he did. An Armagnac man buried an axe in John's face. The attendants beat him like a mattress and cut off his hand as John's assassins had done to their own lord a decade before. The Dauphin claimed that it was not planned, but he had motive, had arranged the means, and had the opportunity. Most of France, including his own parents, believed that their heir to the throne had lured a duke into peace negotiations and murdered him. So the new Duke of Burgundy made his flirtations with the English official and entered an alliance with King Henry. And the French royal family did too. After all, their designated heir was a murderer. No other issue could inherit the throne. But Henry had a claim. So a year after John's slaying, the king and queen of France disinherited their son, married the English king to their daughter, and officially declared Henry and his children the inheritors of the French crown. France was more split than ever, its throne given over to a foreign occupier. Every year the English and their allies pushed further south, and in a small village, a girl named Joan began to speak with saints. February 22nd, 1431, Rouen Castle. A young woman stands amid inquisitors and theologians. She is an illiterate peasant, yet 3 notaries stand ready to scribble her every word. This is a trial where she is both defendant and the only witness, and they are determined to rule her a heretic. They ask her about the first time she heard the voices. It was when she was 13, she said, in her father's garden. I heard the voices on the right-hand side, toward the church, and rarely do I hear it without a brightness. The voice was sent by God, and I knew it was the voice of an angel. Was it an angel, they ask, or a demon? To the villagers of Domnery, there was little hint that Joan would go on to do great things. She came from a farming family, humble, but with a leadership role in the village, and spent her youth spinning cloth and helping in the fields. Most expected her to live, marry, and die in Domremy, just like so many generations of girls had done before her. Though there were a few odd things about her. First off, she was a particularly devout child, one so eager to attend mass and take local pilgrimages that other children teased her for it. And on occasion, she spent excessive time at confession. Her little town of Domremy was a bit of its own world, with its own identity. In fact, Joan didn't even consider herself as living in France. The area where she lived was officially neutral in the ongoing civil war, but most people leaned Armagnac and considered the Dauphin the legitimate king, which was unfortunate, since it was also surrounded by Burgundian territory and subject to raids. Growing up, Joan saw Burgundian troops sack her village. What no one knew, though, even her parents, was that Joan heard voices. They came to her in light, using the language of angels. First, the Archangel Michael, then Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. Initially, they just gave her religious and moral instructions. But when she was 16, they gave her a mission. For months, English and French troops had been locked in a stalemate at the city of Orléans. The voices wanted her to save the city. The voice told me that I should raise the siege laid to the city of Orléans, recalled Joan. And me? I answered it that I was a poor girl who knew not how to ride nor lead a war. Wait, what is that sound? Oh, look everyone, it's our friend the Context Fairy. Have you come to sprinkle asterisks into our episode? Okay, what have you got for us? Oh boy, we're gonna have to do most of this in lies. Sorry, Rob. But here's the gist. Joan of Arc is one of the best documented people of medieval Europe. I know it sounds amazing, but this illiterate peasant left a paper trail longer than many kings. And that's largely because of two spectacular trials. The condemnation trial that opened this episode, and the later nullification trial that overturned her conviction for heresy. But it's hard to untangle whether the story we get from these records is completely true. For the condemnation trial, we get verbatim transcripts of Joan describing her life and visions. But this was also a rigged court, set up by her enemies. And she was arguing for her life. Therefore, it's possible she may have changed details or added to her visions in hopes of convincing the judges that these messages were in line with Catholic thinking. By contrast, the nullification trial, which happened 25 years after her death, mind you, was rigged by her allies to vindicate her. And they did that by collecting testimony from anyone who'd ever met or known Joan. But of course, that was after she'd become a martyred hero, which in all honesty probably colored people's memories. So can we believe these accounts of her early life and visions? Well, maybe. For the sake of this story, we're going to trust them. But it's always good to remember that some bias may be at work. But okay, back to Orléans. Why was it so important? Well, for starters, it was strategically vital, providing access to the Loire River. If it fell, the English could finally roll up the Dauphins' territory in southern France. But it was also psychologically important, because this awful stalemate had come to symbolize this whole phase of the war. You see, when King Charles VI and Queen Isabeau agreed to disinherit the Dauphins and make King Henry of England heir to the French throne, that was game. All Henry had to do was live longer than King Charles, and he would be the legitimate King of France. And that was supposed to be easy mode, since Charles was mentally ill, in poor health, and 18 years his elder. But then, Henry dropped dead at 35. Charles died 2 months later, leaving the French crown in the hands of Henry's 9-month-old son. So in the north, you had a claimant to the throne, supported by a treaty, who was too young to be crowned for 15 years, and in the south, you had a claimant that had the right bloodline, but who was disinherited and couldn't get to the city where all French kings must be crowned. When both kings were alive, people knew what they were fighting for. Now, the conflict had become a rudderless stalemate, with both sides lacking inspiring leadership or the comfort of a righteous cause. Joan's mission was to guide the Armagnacs into a holy war. After receiving her task, Joan slipped out of her village, made her way to a nearby town, and demanded to see the garrison commander. She was on a mission from God, she said. He must provide her with an escort and deliver her to the Dauphins. The commander was not too pleased with this delusional girl, and told her to go back home. But Joan came back, twice, and each time with more followers from the town and surrounding countryside. Eventually, he gave in, and some of his soldiers would accompany Joan to the Dauphins' court. But the road they would take wound through Burgundian territory, a dangerous proposition for a soldier, and even more perilous for a teenaged girl traveling alone with rough men. So Joan's supporters, the peasants and families of the town, decided she should ride in disguise. Joan cut her hair short, and the townspeople gifted her a horse, a sword, and a suit of men's campaigning clothes, the kind that tied together so they were hard to remove by force. And after her long journey, her entrance into court caused a sensation. This young girl had traveled nearly 200 miles through enemy territory to bring the Dauphins a divine message. She'd even dressed like a man to guard her chastity. And that, well, that presented a bit of a theological problem. You see, Joan was not the first holy woman who wanted to share religious visions with the Dauphins. He already had one visit him a decade before, and another who'd taken up residence in a cemetery to preach her visions. But they were a little more orthodox. Joan's message was a political one, and the manner of her dress violated Old Testament rules against women wearing men's clothing. But the issue was, Charles and his court absolutely believed that God sent angels and saints to speak to people. And if Joan's visions were indeed divine, turning her away might bring the wrath of God the Father on his already precarious court. Plus, her message that Charles was indeed the true king was a needed morale boost, and she was a celebrity with a following. People were writing books about her. On the other hand, they also believed that demons could masquerade as angels. And if Joan were a pawn of Satan, inviting her into his court would similarly damn Charles's efforts to regain his rightful throne. And on top of that, he was nervous about looking foolish. So he ordered an investigation. There would be a discernment of spirits, a series of tests to conclude whether Joan's mysterious voices came from heaven or hell. First, a physical examination. Joan called herself La Pucelle, the maid. And that didn't just mean young girl. That meant a virgin. This was a sticking point, because medieval theologians believed only virgin women could receive divine visions. But after retiring to a private area, a group of noblewomen and nuns said she checked out. With that established, Charles then sent her to a group of theologians in order to examine her visions and beliefs. Were they orthodox? Heretical? Did they have a hint of brimstone, perhaps? Was she a virtuous person? Joan came back with a clean bill of spiritual health. She was virtuous and sincere, the theologians said, but they couldn't be sure if her messages really came from a divine source. But not to worry, they'd also come up with an easy way to check. Send her to Orleans. That's right, fit this teenage maid out in armor, send her with the reinforcements that were already headed to the city, and see what she could do. If she managed to break this intractable 6-month siege, they would be pretty darn sure that God was with her. And if not, well, the most they'd lose would be a horse, a suit of armor, and some men who were going there anyway. They sent Joan into a crash course of medieval combat, training her to ride a warhorse and move in plate armor, teaching her basic tactics. Then, they presented her with a white banner, embroidered with Charles's fleur-de-lis symbol of the Trinity, and her chosen symbol, the names of Jesus and Mary. And scholars, for their part, worked overtime digging into obscure prophecies that might support Joan. There had been a long-standing tradition that a maid would emerge to save France, and they marshaled every scrap they could find to support that, including a prediction that supposedly came from Merlin.
Wizards in history, heck yeah!
So backed by shaky prophecies and in a suit of unfamiliar armor, the 17-year-old Joan rode off to war. Letter from Joan of Arc, March 22nd, 1429. King of England, render unto the maid here sent by God the keys of all the good towns which you have taken and violated in France. And you, archers, companions of war, men-at-arms before Orleans, go away to your country by God. And if you do not, expect news of the maid who will come to see you shortly, to your very great injury. King of England, if you do not do so, I am a chieftain of war, and in whatever place I find your people in France, I will make them flee. And if they will not obey, I will have them slain. Ooh, Zoe, you feel that? I'm getting tingles. It was a strange procession that came to relieve the besieged city of Orleans. At the front were not troops, but priests singing hymns and carrying banners. Then came the soldiers, and more numerous than either were the carts full of supplies. And leading them was Joan, dressed in plate armor, astride a white horse. Her pages and squires rode behind, carrying her new banner. It was a column of the devoted. The forces who saw her, Armagnac in the city and English and Burgundian outside, were all exhausted. At the beginning of the siege, the Armagnacs had centered their defenses around the south bank of the Loire, where a quarter-mile bridge, the only way to cross the river, was anchored by a gatehouse. But the English had taken that gatehouse in an assault, forcing the Armagnacs to blow the bridge and cut the city off. The English responded by making the gatehouse their headquarters and building a number of earthen forts around Orleans. This meant that the city was surrounded, but supplies could still slip through if they were swift and protected. Joan's party was armed, and before the English could sally out, they'd reached the bank of the Loire, where ferries could carry them into the city. But there was a problem. When they boarded, the wind wasn't right. The troops and supplies couldn't get across. In fact, now they were vulnerable. If they remained pinned to the bank, the English could marshal forces to wipe them out. Then the wind changed. Upon her arrival, jubilation filled Orleans. As Joan rode through the narrow streets, throngs reached out to touch her, hoping for a blessing. These people had heard of this maid, the one prophesied to save France, the one who had brought them food, the one God had sent to them on a miraculous wind. She took quarters in a house set aside for her, and received a welcome from the city's commanders. And that's when Joan found out that not all was as she expected it to be. Her visions had told her to lead the Armagnac army. But these military men weren't interested in taking orders from a teenaged girl. They welcomed her supplies, sure, and the morale boost she brought was amazing. They invited her to councils of war, where they explained the tactical subtleties of siege warfare. And they even conceded that, maybe, she was on a mission from God. But sieges, they explained, were won by tons of supplies, artillery angles, and precise strategic planning. Success came in months, not days. They would wear down one earthwork, then the next, they told her. Joan, however, had developed an alternative strategy, an intricate plan to dislodge the English from their positions. It went like this, and follow me closely for a minute because this gets a little bit complicated and into the weeds of siege warfare. But her plan was, get 'em. Like full frontal attack, right now, on the strongest position. Huh? After all, God was with them and would reward their faith with victory. Upon hearing this plan, the commanders weren't so keen. They didn't want to waste lives and supplies on an attack that, even if successful, might damage the garrison in the long term. Plus, if it failed, they'd squander the high morale drummed up by Joan's arrival. Their plan was to go a little more of the Captain America route, using Joan as a mascot, sending her out to distribute food and soldiers' pay. Not to, put her in a place where she might get her head shot off with a cannon, which, side note, was a very real threat. The previous English commander had died from just such a lucky shot. But Joan was not about to be some lucky charm. She did the meet and greet duties, but also slipped outside the walls and observed enemy positions. During one outing, she walked to the edge of the destroyed bridge and called the English to surrender. Their commander responded with a rain of insults, calling her a witch, a coward, and saying that the French had taken her from a brothel and put her in armor. He would later regret those insults. But Joan's activities also won over the citizens of Orleans, because unlike the city commanders, Joan was fresh, she promised a quick victory, and she did things like ride out to escort new trains of supplies into the city. And as a result, support for Joan grew. When she rode into the streets, she could barely move due to the crowds. And on one occasion, a mob broke down the door to her house, desperate to see and touch her. Within days, it was clear to the commanders that some kind of action was needed to relieve the pressure. So, they picked an easy target, a less defended earthwork, but also didn't tell Joan, fearing she'd rush to the battle line. And yeah, they were right. Upon being woken and told of the attack, Joan strapped on her armor and rushed to join the troops. Not to fight, but to inspire. She carried her banner, displaying herself, urging them on. And they won. Hours of hard fighting gave the Armagnac defenders their first victory in months. Faith in the Holy Maid soared even higher. The populace sensed imminent liberation. But while the townsmen and soldiers celebrated, Joan turned inward. She'd preached holy warfare and the defeat of the English, but she'd never until now witnessed combat up close. It was awful, a far cry from the glorious victory she'd imagined. This was sadness, though, not doubt. God's will was not to be questioned. So the next day, with the fighting suspended due to a religious feast, she presented a revamped plan. Get home! Not the small fort this time, the biggest, baddest English bastion on the North Bank. The one with the most men. Again, the commanders compromised. They would cross the river on pontoon bridges and attack the weaker forts on the south bank, taking the earthworks in front of the bridge. Then that done, they would attack the gatehouse. Now, was that get 'em enough for Joan? It was. The next day, the army marshaled at the city gates when they noticed that their numbers were larger than usual. The citizens of Orleans had flocked to Joan, organizing militias to fight for their maid. The commanders tried to get them to leave, but she insisted that they come. Joan's second day of battle was hard. The English had abandoned their outer works to concentrate forces in front of the gatehouse. She led the first attack personally, before the Armagnac forces were fully across the river, and was beaten back. The English pursued, only checked when Joan turned and bellowed for them to stop in the name of God. Context fairy, don't think I don't see you. We're just having a little fun. And then, it was a grinding, earthwork by earthwork battle. Joan led the assault, waving her banner and urging the troops on. She limped, one foot pierced by an English caltrop. It was bloody, but by nightfall, the Armagnacs held the earthworks around the gatehouse. The next day, they closed in. Citizens repaired the bridge to hit the gatehouse from two sides. Cannons bombarded the thick stonework. They even sent burning boats in a fruitless attempt to burn the English out, but none of it worked. And as it neared dark, the commanders decided to starve the gatehouse into submission. Joan heard this and grabbed a ladder, because it was time to, and say it with me now, get 'em! She ran toward the last earthwork. Soldiers snatched up scaling ladders and followed her. They would take it by escalade, one of the most dangerous operations in medieval warfare, climbing ladders face first into the blades and missiles of the enemy. Joan threw herself into a ditch, passed off the ladder, and took her banner, yelling that God was with them. Thwack! An arrow slammed into the gap between her helmet and breastplate and buried itself deep in her shoulder. She toppled, carried off the battlefield by her pages. The English jeered that they'd slain the witch, and the attack stalled, men dying in the ditch as they tried to climb their way into English arrows. Rumors of the maid's death were rampant. And then, from behind the French ranks, a white banner rose. Joan stalked back toward the embankment, clad in battered armor. Each step would have been agony. It had only been a flesh wound, but doctors would have had to pull the arrow through her shoulder in order to dislodge it. She insisted on rejoining the attack. Seeing their maid arisen, seemingly unwounded, the French rallied and scaled the final earthwork. English and Burgundian soldiers evacuated to the gatehouse, swarming across the drawbridge in such numbers that the timbers snapped, dropping a handful of men into the Loire River. Among the drowned was the English captain who'd cursed Joan only a few days before. They'd take the gatehouse by nightfall. The next day, Joan drew up her army on the north bank, in front of the English forts there. And to be clear, it was her army now. Sure, other men might command it, but these soldiers fought for her, for this strange holy maid who'd bled with them in battle. She didn't order an attack. The sight of her force was enough to get the English to withdraw. Joan had done what the voices commanded. In 4 days of battle, she'd ended a siege that had dragged on for 6 months. She had her miracle, and none doubted her mission or her power. She saved the Dauphins and opened the door to northern France. And for her next trick, she would give the Dauphins a crown. Jesus Maria, Duke of Burgundy, Joan the Maid requests of you, in the name of the King of Heaven, that the King of France and yourself should make a good, firm, lasting peace. I beg and request of you, with clasped hands, to not fight any battles, nor wage war against us. Neither yourself, your troops, nor subjects, and know beyond a doubt that despite whatever number of soldiers you bring against us, they will never win. And there will be tremendous heartbreak from the great clash, and from the blood that will spill from those who come against us. July 17th, 1429, Reims Cathedral. 4 months before, Joan had met with the Dauphin Charles in private. There, she had promised him that she would relieve the siege of Orleans and bring him to Reims, where all French monarchs were crowned. And while this message from the King of Heaven was welcome, it also seemed incredible. Then, the season of miracles began. After her victory at Orleans, Joan had pressed Charles to take the castles and bridges along the Loire. They'd fallen one by one, with Joan personally leading the troops to the walls. When the English had set up an ambush between two woods, it could have been another Agincourt, but a stag, spooked by the army, had disordered the English ranks. With Joan at the head, Armagnac forces smashed into the English, finally avenging that long-ago defeat. Now, the English were evacuating the Loire Valley. She insisted Charles push for Reims. It was a stretch. The city lay deep in English territory, but she had done it. City after city surrendered to her without a fight, opening their gates after she drafted letters that promised clemency from their God-appointed king and destruction if they defied him. Only one resisted, Troyes, the same city where the Dauphin's parents had signed a treaty disinheriting him. Yet there, too, Joan prevailed. The city's spiritual leader, an apocalypse-preaching friar known for conducting ceremonies where citizens burned board games and beauty products in a bonfire of the vanities, had been so impressed with Joan that he switched sides. The city capitulated after 4 days of Joan parading her banner outside the walls, and the friar now served in her retinue. Joan had brought Charles to Reims without a single death in battle. And now, the Dauphin, no, not the Dauphin anymore. The new king stood among the grand men of his kingdom, anointed with the oil of Clovis, wearing a crown. Joan stood by the king's side with her banner, watching her divine work fulfilled, and her family had been invited and looked on at their daughter, a shepherdess who now wore armor, drank fine wine, and had a staff of servants. It was a perfect moment, the last perfect moment. Because with her divine task complete, Joan entered a strange time. She'd done what she set out to do. So, now what? Up to this point, all of her actions had a focus, an ordained mission she knew was righteous, a shining light that illuminated the path. Her voices still spoke, though, still said it was her mission to drive the English from France. But before, they had had a plan. Relieve Orléans, crown Charles. Now they were getting a little lighter on the specifics. And also, things politically were getting a great deal murkier. Previously, she'd fought the English exclusively, but now she was on the cusp of a campaign where she'd battle fellow Frenchmen. Burgundians. The false French, as the Armagnacs like to call them, but it still felt different. Joan was also embroiled in the profane world of politics. Once Charles got a crown, the first thing he did was to enter truce negotiations with the Burgundians. It was sensible. His treasury couldn't sustain a continued conflict, and there was new territory to consolidate. But negotiations meant give and take, offering to recognize the Duke of Burgundy's powers over the lands given to him by the English, for example, or saying Burgundy didn't have to treat Charles as king. This frustrated Joan. She wanted a truce, sure, and had even sent her own letter to the Duke of Burgundy, but she wanted a truce that acknowledged Charles as king. After all, was not God on their side? And if so, why make a deal with these false French, who had not submitted to the will of the King of Heaven? To Joan, this was as much a pilgrimage as it was a war. If the armies of France marched with faith in their ultimate victory, God would grant them that victory. He had before. And indeed, Joan's supreme faith and inspirational from-the-front leadership style had broken a deadlock that simple military strategy had found intractable. But the larger fact was that logistics, army pay, and other details had also come into the equation. And the king's advisors were increasingly shutting her out of the inner circle. So therefore, it was almost a relief when the Burgundians broke their truce by reinforcing Paris, and the king was persuaded to attack the city. Joan had advocated this course before, and once again she was in the front line, helping place cannons and arguing for her favorite tactic of get on! Charles was, let's say, less enthusiastic. Paris was a risky venture, but he had agreed to an all-out assault with Joan attacking the city's main gatehouse. On the Feast of the Nativity of Our Lady, she unfurled her banner and went to the front. But Paris was unlike any other place she'd ever attacked. It was the best defended city in France, and the Burgundians holding it had popular support. Joan's attack smashed against the defenses, with Joan yelling up at the walls for the Burgundians to surrender. They replied with a squall of crossbow bolts. One slammed deep into Joan's thigh. The man carrying her banner was nailed to the earth by his foot, and when he put up his visor to wiggle the quarrel free, a follow-up shot rammed through his face. Her pages dragged Joan to the rear, and this time, the wound was too serious for her to rejoin the battle. Charles sounded the retreat. Losses from the first day of the siege were heavy enough that he would not authorize a second. There would be no miracle this time. Joan had her first defeat, and Charles instead formed a truce with the Burgundians, leaving the capital still in enemy hands. And that called some things into question. After all, if Joan's victory at Orléans was a miracle, why hadn't heaven similarly intervened at Paris? Everyone went in search of justification. Joan's allies suggested that perhaps she had succumbed to pride and overambition, and that God had simply humbled her. Others said God had withdrawn his support because she attacked on a feast day, usually considered
I have to
too
go
holy
sleep.
for war.
Have a great
and
time.
her enemies claimed that it was evidence she was a witch, and her victory at Orléans a work of Satan, and that the Almighty instead had heard the prayers of Paris's defenders. And the questions, they were getting harder. People were writing her to ask which pope to support, enlisting her
Okie
to
dokie,
condemn
take
Czech
care,
rebels
Bob.
who had
See
insisted
you
the
next
Catholic
time.
Church was corrupt and in need of reform. And she could not explain the defeat in Paris. What did that mean? The truce left her cooling her heels, resting and writing letters, increasingly distant from the king. Then came the gifts. For her service, Charles ennobled Joan and her family, making them minor members of the nobility, and declared her home village exempt from taxation. This was essentially an honorable discharge, a suggestion that her moment had passed, she'd done what she'd promised, and that she should just go home. Charles had decided that his miraculous shepherdess should be put out to pasture. But Joan refused to go. She was a soldier, and she would continue to fight. And thankfully, before the pressure got too great, she was given an assignment. A city was about to come under siege by a combined English and Burgundian force, and she would help relieve it. It wasn't a glorious mission, but the besieged needed her. So, she went. May 23rd, 1430. A raid. Joan and her troops enter the Burgundian camp, ready to sack the supplies. This way, when the enemy reaches the city, the besiegers will have little to eat. Then, shouts. She sees Burgundian troops emerging from ambush, thousands of enemies ready to cut them off. It had been a trap. Her forces flee to the bridge. Men shout for her to cross, to get back into the city. But Joan the Maid does not run from battle. She will stand with her men in the rear guard, letting others escape. Even when 6,000 ambushers encircled the rear guard, cutting them off from the bridge. Even when her enemies surround her. She holds her banner, urges her comrades to fight in the name of God, until an archer hauls her from the saddle. She insists that she will only surrender to their officer. After all, she is an ennobled soldier of France, the Maid of Orleans. Her rank demands nothing less. But these Burgundians don't ransom her back to Charles like any other knight. They move her from prison to prison for nearly a year. Joan tries to escape her first prison by breaking through the floor. In response, they move her to a tower in another castle. More months pass. Joan stares out the window, heartsick over the besieged city she couldn't rescue. Every day, her voices tell her she mustn't jump. Then Joan hears she's been sold to the English. She decides she would rather die trying to flee than be a prisoner of her enemies. But it's 70 feet to the ground, and if she jumps, she could very well kill herself. And suicide is a mortal sin. Her voices tell Joan not to do it. They insist that God will rescue her. She, in turn, ignores them, puts one foot on the ledge, and launches herself into the night. February 21st, 1431, Rouen Castle. Do you swear to speak the truth in answer to such questions as are put to you? Asks Bishop Cauchon. I do not know what you wish to examine me on, responds Joan. Perhaps you might ask such things I would not tell. Will you swear to speak the truth upon those things which are asked of you concerning your faith, which you know? Concerning my father and mother, and what I've done since I took the road to France, I will gladly swear to tell the truth. But concerning my revelations from God, these I have never told or revealed to anyone, save only to Charles, my king, and I will not reveal them to save my head. It's the first day of Joan's inquisitional trial for heresy. She is both the defendant and the only witness, and she's arguing for her life. Joan survived the leap from the tower, landing on a soft patch of earth. But the fall had gone badly, and she laid injured until her jailers collected her, her voices whispering comfort. But her worry came to pass. The Burgundians sold her to the English, and there would be a trial for witchcraft and heresy conducted by her enemies. As they prepared, Joan languished in prison. English and Burgundian lords visited to Lirat and Groper. She was constantly alone with male soldiers. She still wore men's clothing, though, for it was a greater defense against assault than a dress. Outside her cell, the inquisitional trial was taking shape. At its head was Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a clergyman who'd been a long supporter of English interests in France. In fact, he'd personally negotiated Joan's sale to the English. So this trial was not exactly fair, because you see, after Joan got Charles crowned at Arras, the English, not to be outdone, had rushed their boy king, Henry VI, into the country in order to crown him King of France. But Charles was still claiming, through Joan, that God supported his claim. However, if Cauchon could prove in court that Joan was either a heretic, a witch, or a liar, it would go a long way toward undercutting Charles's claim to the throne. It was a trial designed to discredit Joan and her visions. Yet Cauchon knew it couldn't be an obvious hit job. Everyone knew the English and Burgundians hated Joan and expected a slanted court. Therefore, the verdict must be unimpeachable. Cauchon insisted on following strict procedure, enlisting some of the finest theological minds in France to serve as examiners. Every questioning session, every move by the court, every piece of evidence would be recorded. He wanted everyone to know how they'd come to their conclusions. Yet his initial background investigation wasn't promising. An investigator sent to Domremy to dig up dirt came back empty-handed, and a group of English noblewomen confirmed Joan was a virgin, meaning she wasn't lying about being a maid. But that still left the charge of heresy, of harboring beliefs that differed from established church doctrine. And if Joan refused to recant, that was a death sentence. So the dance began. Joan insisted that they let her take Mass. The prosecutor, for his part, insisted that she could not hear Mass while dressed as a man, and Joan countered that her garments protected her. Then the questioning portion of the trial opened, with Joan standing in a castle hall amid 50 or 60 churchmen. Now she had an audience. Joan began sparring with the court over her oath to be truthful. She agreed to answer questions about her past and her faith, but not her visions. It was an argument that would repeat every day. And over the next week and a half, the court would probe her about her past, her beliefs, and every step of her journey since leaving Dorami. They asked about whether she had disobeyed her parents by leaving, about obscure village folk beliefs, and of course, about her visions. Her examiners were learned men, versed in theology, and with decades of education in canon law. Joan, by contrast, was an illiterate peasant who had only recently learned to sign her name on the letters she dictated. Yet, she pushed back. Her voices told her to be bold, to argue, to challenge. And though not traditionally schooled, she had a sharp mind and had absorbed much in her years as a devoted Catholic. On the third day, when the inquisitors asked her whether she believed she would go to heaven, the court held its breath. Because, yes, thank you, Admiral, it was a trap. If Joan said no, she would be admitting a state of sin. But if she said yes, she would contradict church doctrine that humans could not truly know whether they were in grace. So either way, it would be an admission of heresy. If I am not in his grace, she answered, may God put me there. And if I am, may God so keep me. I should be the saddest creature in the world if I knew I were not in his grace. Her eloquence on the issues stunned the court. Questions of faith she batted away with ease that puzzled her questioners, and Joan reveled in this performance. But when speaking of visions, though, she evaded, circled, outright refused. And this was wise, because she was not as well versed in church doctrine involving spiritual beings, and if she spoke about it, might unknowingly create an opening. For days, Cauchon and the inquisitors hammered at her. Who told you to wear men's clothing? Why did you do it, despite the fact the Old Testament forbids it? Name the voices. Convince us you've seen the saints. He urged Joan to describe her visions beyond seeing light and hearing voices. Was it the voice of God, saints, or angels? If saints, did they give her a sign to convince others that her visions were real? This, too, was a snare. You see, church doctrine held that saints and angels were beings of pure spirit, and they had no corporeal bodies. So if Joan described seeing them in the flesh, you get where he was going. He took away her audience and began questioning her in private in her cell. The cracks began to show. She said the voices were the Archangel Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, and that they appeared to her, solid as her inquisitors, and she knew them by the symbols they carried. And when pressed, Joan described a vision she'd had at Charles's court, where an angel walked into the audience hall and placed a jeweled crown on the Dauphin's head. But she still refused to reveal exactly what she'd said to the Dauphin in private. And finally, Cauchon considered using torture. And indeed, he showed Joan the implements, hoping the sight of these tools of pain would force a confession. But they did not. However, Joan was already ill, and they did worry that if they tortured her, she might die in custody. So tabling torture, they drew up their findings and read them to her. 12 charges. She would need to answer them the next day. May 24th, 1431. Joan stands on a scaffold in a graveyard, formally charged with heresy. The prosecutors had determined that either she had fabricated the visions or they were demons. Then, a surprise. If she doesn't answer these charges, they say, they will execute sentence immediately. Joan's voices had promised that they'd deliver her from captivity.
Not yet,
but now, time was up. She gave in to fear and confessed. The inquisitors had not expected that, but they were delighted. After all, the best outcome of a heresy trial was one where the accused recanted and was welcomed back into the church. Joan would live, just in captivity. They shaved her head, put her in the dress she'd so resisted. But 2 days later, Cauchon got a message. He rushed to Joan's cell. She was back in men's clothes, agitated. One story said her guards had assaulted her. Another claimed they'd forced her into her old clothing. She babbled. Her voices were angry that she had recanted out of fear, and she worried God would turn her away. A confessed heretic could live, but one who returned to their sin must die. And so, the next day, they burned her in the old marketplace. One English soldier held a cross high so she could look at it as the flames consumed her, and the executioner ensured that nothing was left, no bones the faithful could venerate. And finally, they threw her ashes into a river. Cauchon spread the transcripts across Europe to show they'd been right to convict her. King Charles reportedly swore vengeance for her death, but he made no public statements. In fact, he already had a new holy youth, a shepherd boy that showed the stigmata. In time, the English killed him too. But if the English had hoped that Joan's death would change the course of the war, they were wrong. In 1449, 18 years after Joan's execution, Charles entered the English capital of Rouen in victory. The English were well on the way to being driven out of France, where the father had been known as Charles the Beloved and Charles the Mad. The son would be known as Charles the Victorious. And part of that victory was to instigate a retrial, just as politically motivated as the first, that cleared Joan in 1453. Because in the 22 years since the first trial, politics had changed a great deal. With the Armagnac and Burgundian at peace, everyone was eager to rewrite history, recasting the war as one of French against English.
At least it's
and
worth
of course,
it, I hope.
Charles's continued success seemed to vindicate Joan's visions. Even people who had participated in the first trial emerged to denounce it as corrupted by politics. Joan was no longer a champion for the Armagnacs. This soldier from a bitter civil war was now seen as a champion of all of France. And her status as a national symbol would only grow over the centuries. And in 1920, the same church that had condemned Joan as a heretic officially declared her a saint. The girl who had defended Orléans, taken the Loire castles, and failed outside the walls of Paris, had made one final conquest. For now,
I don't know,
she'd
man,
stormed
but
the
yeah, hope
gates
it
of
worked.
heaven.
And speaking of historically heroic acts, did you know that our patrons over on Patreon have been our defenders in ensuring we can continue to make this series for all of you? Because sadly, YouTube ad revenue just isn't enough on its own to cover the production costs of weekly animated episodes and to pay the team of creatives that craft them. Though our patrons are also entrusted with another sacred duty: choosing the topics our full series will cover. Okay, here's how it works. Every Extra History series subject is chosen through a two-step process. First, lead EH writer Rob comes up with a theme, something
Yeah,
like
man,
the
hard work will
Napoleonic
always
era,
prove
or
your
anything
worth.
but a war. Then, patrons get to send us a bunch of topics within that theme. We look them all over, get super impressed at the creativity y'all bring every single time, and then cut them down to a short list of final topics. And finally, we run a poll for our patrons to vote for their favorite, and bam! A patron-chosen series is greenlit, and 6 weeks of content is born. So if you'd like to join our Patreon community, not only will you be helping us create the content that you love, but you'll also have access to a ton of cool perks, like having your name in the credits. Ooh, or having your name in the credits next to a custom bean art portrait of your face, or viewing all of our shows 24 hours early, or an invitation to our official Discord to chat it up, or exclusive 4K wallpapers and never-before-seen digital posters, or 20% off our merch store where you can and should totally snag this sweet Zoe shirt, or and a lot more. Wait, that last part got away from me, but you get where I'm going with this, right? So whether you'd like to join an awesome community, help forge the future of Extra History, see your name on the little screen, or just want to make sure we can keep creating all our shows, please consider becoming a patron via the link below. We would very much appreciate it. Plus, you know, if you do, you'll be joining the splendiferous ranks of Angelo Valenciana, Acolyte Games, Dominic Valenciana, Fox Dark Hunters, and Izzy Coin, Joseph Blame, and Kuya Koi, a legendary Patreons! Thanks all.
Hungary, 1474. The artist's hands shake as he sets up his easel and paints. Across from him sits a man infamous throughout the land. Some call him a hero, the only man willing to defend Eastern Europe from the armies of the Ottoman Sultan, while others say he's a monster, a fiend, who impales men, women, and children on long spikes and feasts beneath their jerking corpses. And according to one story, he dips his bread in the warm blood that splatters his plate. This legend in front of the artist has a face that matches the stories. A sharp nose, heavy eyebrows, and bulging green eyes.
For over a decade, the man has been a captive here. But soon, he'll be unleashed again. Vlad III, son of the dragon, Dracula. Welcome, friends! Today, we will be discussing Vlad the Impaler, aka Dracula, a 15th century Romanian ruler who... What? I'm doing a bit. All right. Take the fangs out. They kind of hurt anyway. Actually, it's for the best, because as fun as it is to make vampire jokes, the true story of Vlad the Impaler is actually more interesting, revealing, and dare I say bloody, than the literary counterpart that stole his name. Vlad III, later known as the Impaler, is by far the most famous Romanian historical figure. But he's famous in a strange sense. In his homeland, he's a national hero, seen as a champion of independence and resistance against Ottoman expansion. But outside Romania, he's mostly perceived as the psychopath and sadist that inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula. In fact, word of his violent deeds spread even during his lifetime, as printmakers in Germany churned out exaggerated or invented stories about him. In other words, centuries before Stoker's birth, Vlad's story was already intertwined with myth, which makes him difficult to talk about. So just to state this up front, our plan with this series is to first discuss the historical Vlad, and then do a separate episode on the complex legacy of his memory, where yes, we promise we'll talk about all the Dracula stuff. Because actually, Dracula is Rob's favorite classic novel.
And we did an entire episode on that book on our literary show, So You Haven't Read. It's awesome, I love it, and you should definitely go take a bite out of that after you finish learning about Vlad here.
But okay, back to history. To understand Vlad the man, we have to go back to the time of his father, Vlad II, known as Dracul, or the Dragon. Vlad Dracul got that name after Sigismund, King of Hungary, and later the Holy Roman Emperor, made him a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order that vowed to defend Eastern Europe from the Ottoman Empire. These two, they were close. See, Vlad II grew up as a hostage at Sigismund's court. A common practice then, which was half like going to boarding school and half like, well, being a hostage. Vlad's father, the ruling prince of Wallachia, had agreed to be a vassal of the Hungarian king, with Vlad living within decapitating distance of the Hungarian throne to keep his father honest, i.e., betray me and I kill your kid. Yet Sigismund was pretty chummy with Vlad, educating him and showing him favor, because Sigismund's ideal outcome wasn't for Vlad to die. It was for him to succeed his father and rule Wallachia as a close ally of Hungary. But why? I mean, why would Hungary, much larger than it is today, put so much effort into controlling a relatively small principality? Well, as they say in real estate, location, location, location. Wallachia was, essentially, the buffer zone for a major conflict brewing in Eastern Europe. The expansionist Ottoman Empire had rolled over the Balkans, and the then powerful Kingdom of Hungary wanted a friendly ruler in Wallachia to keep it free of Ottoman control and the famous Ottoman janissaries off Hungary's borders. But the throne of Wallachia was a bit of a mess, and keeping anyone on it was a big project. Vlad Dracul's own father had been prince twice before he died in 1418, and 5 other of Vlad's cousins and half-brothers had also sat on the throne by 1436. Some multiple times. That's because monogamy was more of a suggestion for Wallachian nobles rather than a strict rule, and that created an enormously twisted family tree of backstabbing and usurpation that meant the average time on the throne during Vlad Dracul's lifetime was only around 2 to 3 years. But it wasn't until 1434 that Sigismund thought about a regime change. That's of course when one of Vlad's brothers, currently the prince, sent envoys to pledge allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan, Murad II. In response, Sigismund gave Vlad a bunch of money to raise an army of exiled Wallachian boyars, basically the noble class, to seize the throne. He succeeded in 1436, mostly because his brother died of an illness, and Vlad's first act was to cancel the unratified treaty his predecessor had drawn up with the Ottomans. Then, 2 things happened. First, the Ottomans invaded in response, then a month later, Sigismund died, triggering a Hungarian internal crisis that meant Wallachia wasn't going to be getting any of its promised military aid. So, Vlad Dracul decided to forego that whole Order of the Dragon, Battle the Turks thing, pledged fealty to Murad II, and guided an Ottoman army into Hungary. But that Ottoman force was defeated, leaving the Hungarians furious with Vlad. See, the problem that would bedevil Vlad, and his son Dracula as well, was that Wallachia was a small country between big powers.
and siding with one, invited the other to either attack him militarily or to try to put another relative on the Wallachian throne. In 1442, Vlad took a meeting with John Hunyadi, a Hungarian vassal and Prince of Transylvania, remember him, he's important, who convinced Vlad to withdraw his support from a planned Ottoman invasion of Transylvania. Vlad, hoping to stay neutral, didn't join the invasion, but did let Murad's forces cross Wallachia to attack Hunyadi. Now, it was Murad II who was furious with Vlad, and when he called him in for an explanation, he jailed him along with his two youngest sons, only releasing him to reclaim his throne once he'd sworn not to act against Ottoman interests, and pledged to send 500 children a year to join the elite Ottoman Janissary Corps. But when he was released from Ottoman custody, he left a few things behind. Namely, his 11-year-old son Vlad III, known by his preferred honorific of Dracula, or Son of the Dragon. Oh, that's right. Just like Daddy Dragon got ditched as a hostage at Sigismund's court, this little dragon got left as a hostage with the Ottomans, along with his brother Radu, who was around 7. And these two brothers couldn't have been more different. Radu got along just fine at the Ottoman court. He was charming, intelligent, and good-looking, eventually even earning the title Radu the Handsome. He befriended the Sultan's son Mehmed II, and his studies in Turkish, the Quran, logic, mathematics, and philosophy flourished. Vlad, on the other hand, didn't get on so well. Neither charming nor handsome, he got none of the fawning attention Radu received, and his defiant attitude meant he regularly felt the lash of a tutor's whip. Yet while they were generally well treated, they were also in danger. A fact brought home when the brothers saw two boys, fellow Eastern European hostages, blinded with red-hot irons as punishment for communicating with their father. As always, Vlad's bulging green eyes saw everything. He saw the Ottoman court, memorizing its functions and ways. He observed military drills close up, and was raised along with Mehmed, gaining first-hand knowledge of a future enemy. He observed the terror tactics the Ottoman states used to keep vassals and populations in line, and he learned another hard lesson, that politics wasn't personal. Betraying your family was okay, if it gave you more power. Then one day, a messenger arrived, saying that Vlad and Radu's privileges were being stripped. They would now live in harsher conditions, separated from the court. For it seems their father, the dragon, knowing it would mean the death of his sons, had joined John Hunyadi in a crusade to eject the Ottomans from Europe, which didn't go very well. The Crusaders marched to total defeat, and then in the fallout, Vlad Dracul gave confusing signals of which side he was actually on. But ultimately, he resubmitted himself as a vassal to Sultan Murad, allowing Vlad Dracula and Radu, who he was surprised to learn were still alive, to come home. Yet, as I'm sure you've gathered by now, in making this peace, Vlad Dracul had invited war. Because now John Hunyadi stormed into Wallachia, hoping to put a pretender named Vladislav on the Wallachian throne. Because this story really needed more guys named Vlad. Vlad Dracula and Radu the Handsome fled back to the Ottomans, while their eldest brother, who stayed to fight with their father, got caught by a group of rebel boyars, who blinded him with a red-hot poker and buried him alive. And days later, Hunyadi and his men ran down Vlad II in a marsh. The dragon was dead, his throne given to a pretender. Which meant that now, in 1448, it was finally time for young Vlad to enter Wallachia and reclaim what was his. So with military support from the Ottoman Sultan, the Son of the Dragon marched to his revenge, and Dracula was unleashed. Ottoman Empire, 1447. This is how Romanian folklore says it happened. When Vlad Dracul was being run down in a marsh, when he knew that he'd be caught and killed by the pretender Vladislav, he gave his sword and pendant to a loyal boyar.
Take them to my son.
For 5 days, the boyar rode, evading enemies and crossing rivers, until he entered the Ottoman Empire and presented them to Vlad Dracula. And as the boyar recounted the deaths of his father and brother, Dracula stood staring at the sword and pendant, both given to his father by Sigismund, both marked with the iconography of the Order of the Dragon. And there, the 17-year-old Vlad Dracula swore that he would not rest until he had avenged his murdered kin, and that he would personally, with his own hand, slay the pretender Vladislav. While the story we started with may be folklore, it does capture a solid truth. When John Hunyadi's invasion killed Vlad's father and brother, it put the teenage hostage into play.
Murad seems to have told Vlad of the deaths himself, and then followed it up by making him an officer in the Ottoman military. Because despite the greater popularity of his younger brother Radu, Vlad's seriousness and determination had convinced Sultan Murad that this was the prince they wanted ruling Wallachia as an ally. And considering how brutally Hunyadi and his allies had killed Vlad's family, Murad also assumed that any chance of the young prince defecting to the Hungarians was most likely buried alive with Vlad's older brother. Plus, it was the perfect time to reclaim Wallachia for the Dracul dynasty. For when John Hunyadi and Vladislav marched into Ottoman-held Serbia, Murad had dealt them a shattering defeat outside Kosovo. In fact, the rout was so chaotic that no one even knew if Hunyadi or Vladislav had survived. Seeing his chance, Vlad stormed into Wallachia with a Turkish cavalry force and seized the throne, a dramatic beginning to a powerful and bloody reign. Soon, Vlad would take revenge on the boyars who had betrayed his father and brother, and would carve a swath across all of the land of— Oops, sorry. Funny story, Vladislav actually turned up, both very alive and with an army, recaptured the throne, and sent Vlad back into exile. His first reign lasted all of 2 months. At first, he fled back to the Ottomans, but things weren't safe there either. Vladislav, though he'd accepted Hunyadi's help to be installed on the throne of Wallachia under the explicit agreement that he'd fight the Turks, was discovering the same thing Vlad's father had. Wallachia simply couldn't survive against the Ottomans without Hungarian aid, and Hungary was a mess. Soon Wallachian boyars pressured him to make peace with the Sultan. So he sent envoys to Sultan Murad looking to strike a deal. And Vlad, rightfully worried his death might be a condition of the bargain, fled to Moldavia. And Vlad received a warm welcome there. For that year, his uncle had become the ruler of Moldavia, and his cousin Stephen the heir apparent. And the 3 years that Vlad spent there, connecting with his cousin and getting a Renaissance education, were likely some of the happiest of his life. He even got a taste of military glory, helping his uncle and cousin turn back a Polish force. Good days. Though the time was abruptly cut short when his uncle's half-brother assassinated him, and Vlad and Stephen both fled to Hungary, where he was forced to play cat and mouse with John Hunyadi, going from town to town, hiding with sympathetic boyars, and at one point slipping away just as a squad of ambushers tried to catch and assassinate him. Then everything changed again. First, Sultan Murad died, and in his place rose his more vigorous and ambitious son Mehmed, who declared it his top priority to finally conquer Constantinople. A goal made possible since while the city was still a trade center and symbolically important, it had declined in military power. Hunyadi's star was falling as well. While he was still revered as the most famous crusader against the Turks, his 2 recent defeats had tarnished his reputation. I mean, a few years before, he'd essentially ruled Hungary on behalf of a child king, but now he was back to just being a plain old prince of Transylvania. And then Vladislav. Well, Vladislav was aligning ever closer with the Ottomans, meaning Hunyadi was suddenly shopping for a new prince of Wallachia, which set up an interesting space for an approach between Hunyadi and Vlad, because each did have something the other wanted. Hunyadi could give Vlad legitimacy, official recognition in Hungary, and a path to reclaim his throne. And in turn, Vlad could give Hunyadi an able partner who knew the Ottoman military and leadership from the inside, and who could replace Vladislav if necessary. Striking this deal, however, meant that Vlad would need to join the man who'd slaughtered his family. But in an ironic twist, Vlad's father of all people had prepared him for this decision, back when he'd abandoned Vlad as a hostage with the Ottomans. Politics was impersonal, and if reclaiming his throne meant foregoing vengeance, then so be it. Vlad became a noble at Hunyadi's court, and his new patron took him to the coronation of the new Hungarian king, Ladislaus the Posthumous, where he took an oath, formally, to act as an ally of Hungary and the Catholic Church. His role would be the same as his father's, halting the Ottomans' advance and reclaiming Christian lands. And with his oath sworn, the Hungarian Diet charged Vlad with defending the Transylvanian frontier against the Ottomans and their Wallachian allies, a duty his father also held. News of Constantinople's fall in 1453, while no surprise, did sour the celebrations. Stories had filtered in that the Ottomans had impaled prisoners in front of the city walls, a punishment used by both Ottomans and German Saxons as a way to scare the garrison into surrendering. Believing the city would fall, and wanting to preserve his strength for defending his own territory, Hunyadi opted against sending troops to Constantinople. But he knew that Mehmed would not stop with the bastion of Eastern Christendom, and the next place on the chopping block would be the Hungarian frontier city of Belgrade. So in 1456, he whipped up an army of mercenaries and marched to relieve the city, leaving Vlad to defend the pass into Transylvania and keep Vladislav tied down. Hunyadi's forces reached Belgrade just as the besieged city was ready to fall, broke through the Turkish lines, and managed to get inside the citadel to reinforce the beleaguered garrison. They broke the siege, repelling Mehmed's forces after weeks of combat. Hunyadi, the White Knight who had fought the Ottomans for decades, had relieved Belgrade, an event described as a miracle. But a miracle that went sour, as plague swept into his camp, killing Hunyadi and the expedition's other leader. But Vlad Dracula had little time to mourn the enemy-turned-mentor, for his goal had been to tie up Vladislav's forces, and he knew the best way to do it. Invasion. As he crossed into his homeland, he looked up to see a fell star burning in the heavens, Halley's Comet, a celestial body that people across the world interpreted as either a sign of impending catastrophe or great events. And meeting his enemy's army outside the Wallachian capital of Targovishta, Vlad took the burning star as a sign of coming victory. We know little about what happened next. According to one story, the relatively small armies clashed, but in another, the forces decided to settle the issue by single combat. Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon, against his cousin Vladislav, Prince of Wallachia. Though in both versions, Vlad slays the pretender with his own hand. When he took the throne, his coins were stamped with the five-tailed comet, the symbol of his victory. But that victory would be difficult to hold on to, because while he agreed to pay Mehmed 2,000 gold as tribute, and agreed to let the Ottoman armies cross his lands, these agreements were only to buy time for him to build and repair more fortresses and solve internal problems at home. For the faction of boyars who had brought him to the throne were a small minority of the nobility. Most had supported the slain Vladislav, including those who had risen up and killed Vlad's brother at the prompting of John Hunyadi. Indeed, it was only months into his second reign when a young boyar raised an army of mercenaries to dethrone the young prince. But Vlad ambushed the little band as they marched toward Targovishta, and made an example of them no one would miss. His troops sharpened long stakes, greased them, and then shoved them into the bodies of the noble and all his male kin. Then he left them, still living, beside the road to die over the coming days. Over time, he would refine this gruesome method of execution, until history remembered him chiefly for the brutal spectacle. Vlad the Impaler had arrived, and his enemies would suffer. Targovishta, Easter, 1457. The Wallachian boyars are feasting at Vlad Dracula's table. In their fine Easter clothes, they raise cups to their new prince. The past, they say, is forgotten. But Vlad does not forget. Suddenly, there's a commotion, and soldiers begin grabbing their arms. Vlad then separates the boyars and their families who had risen against his father and buried his brother alive, marching them out into the spring cold. The oldest are immediately impaled, while the others are force-marched down to a town below a ruined mountain fortress and told to pick up the freshly made bricks there. They will carry the bricks up the mountain, rebuilding Vlad's new castle for the rest of their short lives. Their fine clothes tearing and falling away until they're nearly naked, and most work until they collapse and die. Ah, but who cares if the boyars perish from frostbite and exhaustion, huh? Vlad is the prince, and he can appoint new nobles. Now, if you watched the first 2 chapters of this video and thought, I thought this guy was called Vlad the Impaler, but he's hardly impaled anyone. Bring on the impaling! After this episode, you might regret that ask, because this part of the tale contains like a bajillion% more impalings and violence. Seriously, it's a lot. So please let this serve as a content warning for everything that follows, because this one's going to get brutal. But before we go there, I want to take a slight detour and talk about state violence during this era, since it's important to understanding Vlad, his times, and how he's remembered. The 15th century was a particularly bloody time in Europe, one where violence was commonplace in everyday life. Few laws governed warfare, and rebellions often ended with massacres or mass executions. And it was common all over Europe to keep populations in line with displays of extreme violence, as this was an era of gory public executions and torture. English kings put heads on spikes, French ones broke people on the wheel, and the Spanish had the Inquisition. In other words, public displays of cruelty were a form of political communication. We say this not to excuse Vlad. Actually, if anything, it does the opposite, because even by these standards, his campaigns of violence were considered extreme. While we don't have a lot of primary source documents on Vlad, and things written about him or preserved orally are likely exaggerated, there is a clear theme that emerges when we look at his second reign. When he gained the throne in 1457, Vlad embarked on a planned, deliberate campaign to break the power of the Boyars, which had been on the rise since the time of his grandfather. In fact, the instability of the Wallachian throne was not all due to outside interventions by Hungary and the Ottomans. It had as much, if not more, to do with the Wallachian Boyars, who always tried to steer the weakest candidate to the throne and increase the power of their own council. Vlad, on the other hand, tended toward the aristocratic, centralized version of power that was on the rise in the Renaissance. In Vlad's mind, it would be he who controlled Wallachia, not the Boyars and not the church. And the only way to keep the throne would be to become as powerful as possible. "You can judge for yourselves," he explained in a letter to the Transylvanian town of Brașov. "When a man or prince is strong and powerful, he can make peace as he wants to. But when he is weak, a strong man will come and do what he wants to him." His first act was to purge the Boyars of any deemed unfaithful or ambitious, frequently executing them via impalement. Between 1457 and 1461, he replaced all but 2 Boyars in his royal council, a body that rarely changed, even as the prince did, suggesting he likely surrounded himself with loyalists. Those loyalists came from a lower strata of the Boyar class, while others were mercenaries or followers from his exile in Transylvania. Basically people that owed their elevation directly to Vlad, and who often had no previous ties or allegiances in Wallachia. And the wealth and land that Vlad gave them had, conveniently enough, been provided by their predecessors, who didn't need it anymore. He also instituted a campaign of terror in order to enforce public order. Now, we have to be cautious when discussing this, since first-hand records about his domestic massacres are lacking, and those written by outsiders, based on reports within the country, likely include some exaggeration. But even Romanian oral traditions that are kind to Vlad, casting him as tough but fair, still emphasize his extreme cruelty. Thieves were beheaded, unfaithful wives skinned alive, lazy peasants impaled, Roma people forced into the military or boiled alive. A Romanian folktale tells of how he threw a banquet for beggars, then locked the doors and burned the hall down to stop them burdening the state. And several accounts discuss him impaling priests who did not show him suitable respect. In another story, 2 diplomats, in some versions representatives of the Ottomans, in others Genoese Italians, once said it was against their custom to remove either their turbans or skullcaps before Vlad. So, he supposedly honored this tradition by having their head coverings nailed to their skulls. And while we can't verify the truth of all these stories, they all share common elements. They portray a ruler who is trying to assert not only his own authority, but who wants to enforce a strict moral code, emphasizing hard work and deference to authority. They also suggest a tendency towards sadism. But the massacres reached a new height when it came to the Transylvanian town of Brașov, which he had wrote to early in his reign, promising his protection if they agreed he could retreat there in the event of being dethroned. Though relations between Vlad and Brașov got rocky fast. See, Brașov was the center of German-Saxon settlement in Transylvania, and a major location for trade and manufacturing. And while it happily sent Vlad artisans, it was also under pressure from Hungary, who by this point realized Vlad was not going to be a Hungarian vassal, to throw their support behind one of Vlad's relatives instead. 2 of which, just happened to be hanging around Saxon Transylvania, waiting for their moment. Including Vlad's half-brother, Vlad the Monk. Because again, this series needed more guys named Vlad. Vlad kept up the dance of diplomacy with the Transylvanian Saxons for a couple of years, ordering them to expel the pretenders, and occasionally carrying out reprisals to make it happen. But by 1459, when the Saxons recognized a 3rd pretender, his patience ran out. He rounded up 41 Brașov merchants living in Wallachia and impaled them. Then he had 300 other Saxons burned alive, claiming that some were spies. Then he led a 2-pronged attack into southern Transylvania, burning towns and attacking the outskirts of Brașov before withdrawing. This attack killed thousands and remains one of Vlad's most infamous acts. In retaliation, the Saxons of Brașov threw their full support behind another one of Vlad's relatives, Dan the Pretender, to make a try for the throne. And just from the fact that history remembers this guy as the Pretender, you can probably guess that that did not go well.
Captured after a brief battle, Dan supposedly knelt while his grave was dug in front of him, all the while a priest conducting a burial service while the terrified man was still alive, all of which climaxed when an executioner's axe fell, dropping the pretender's head into an open pit. 3 years into his second reign, Vlad had, through utter brutality, achieved many of his goals. He terrorized the boyars into submission or replaced them, strengthened his power, and created a spectacle of gore so incredible that both pretenders to the throne and foreign enemies along the border would think twice about trying to unseat the son of the dragon. And so he turned to foreign policy, the Ottomans. Though Vlad started his reign by paying Mehmed financial tribute, that first payment was the only one he'd sent. And by 1461, he was 3 years past due, and Mehmed was looking for a meeting to clear up the diplomatic frostiness. The envoys of Mehmed came in force, a Greek diplomat and a Turkish commander at their head. They had planned to capture Vlad, much like Murad had captured Vlad's father. Instead, Vlad's army came out of hiding, surrounding the Turkish force, and upon marching them back to Targovishte, the Ottoman envoys beheld a stake erected for each of them, with 2 higher than the others, one for the Greek diplomat and one for the Turkish commander. Within weeks, Vlad's army was across the Danube River, ravaging Turkish territory, impaling thousands of prisoners, and burning civilians in their homes. Vlad was going to war against the Ottoman Empire, a clash that would prove a reunion, for leading the Turkish army against him was his childhood companion Mehmed, and at the Sultan's right hand, someone even closer to home, Vlad's own brother, Radu the Handsome. Oh boy. 1461, the Danube. Vlad Dracula puts pen to paper to tell his ally Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, about how many he has killed attacking Ottoman territory. 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians in all, not including those who were burned in their houses and whose heads were not presented to our officials. But he also writes this will lead to an all-out war with Mehmed. When the weather permits, that is to say in the spring, they will come with evil intentions and with all of their power. And when they did, Vlad would find himself fighting alone. Vlad's attack on Ottoman territory across the Danube River didn't just come out of nowhere. He knew that his brother Radu was still on the Ottoman court, just in case Vlad needed to be replaced, and he was aware of Mehmed's expansionist designs. Indeed, it was obvious to everyone an attack was coming, because a few years earlier, Pope Pius II and the Venetians had raised money in order to fund a crusade that would prevent further Ottoman expansion. But while Matthias Corvinus, Frederick III, and other rulers had taken the Pope's money, because, free money, they were slow to actually do anything productive with it. Because while most European monarchs talked a big game about defending against the Muslim Turks, the reality was that for most kingdoms, their Christian neighbor states were a much more credible threat. In fact, in desperation, Pope Pius reached out to other Muslim states in hopes of convincing them to attack the Ottomans to keep Mehmed tied down. Plus, Vlad had his own border troubles, namely his cousin Stephen, who he'd helped put on the throne of Moldavia. But now Stephen had switched sides and became an Ottoman vassal, massing his troops on Vlad's borders so that if the Ottomans came, Vlad would have to fend off armies from 2 directions. That came to pass in 1462, when one night, Mehmed and Vlad's brother Radu led Ottoman forces across the Danube and into Wallachia. Vlad opposed him with a battery of cannons, but when the Ottomans raised their own artillery positions and began firing back, he withdrew. Vlad was simply outnumbered and outgunned. Mehmed had between 60 and 70,000 troops and 120 cannons, whereas Vlad could only muster 10,000 soldiers in his main force, most of which peasants, rather than professionals. Now, a word of caution here. While we do know what happened in this war, there's still a debate about the location, order of events, and even what Vlad and Mehmed's strategic objectives were. Mehmed, for his part, probably didn't want to outright conquer Wallachia and bring it into the empire. It was more valuable, after all, as a buffer zone against Hungary, but of course with the more dependable Radu in charge rather than Vlad. Also, he was interested in Stephen helping him take back a Black Sea fortress. Whereas Vlad, of course, wanted to stay on the throne and expel Mehmed from his lands. But he did know he couldn't beat Mehmed in the field, so instead, he used guerrilla tactics. He sent word for Wallachian civilians to flee to the Carpathian Mountains, then retreated, burning the land behind him and poisoning water sources to deny the Ottoman army food. Then his horsemen harried Mehmed's column, striking and disappearing, occasionally taking captives, waiting for a moment to land a hard blow. Which came when the Ottoman army camped outside of the capital of Targovishte, not noticing that spies passed in their midst. According to folklore, one of those spies was in fact Vlad himself, using his command of Turkish to pass himself off as a soldier. And whether true or not, the scouts learned what they needed to know: the location of Mehmed's tent. Wallachian cavalry screamed into the unaware Ottoman force, slashing down with swords and burning canvas tents, killing hundreds in the shock assault before many in the Ottoman camp could even pick up weapons. And Vlad stormed through the melee, slicing his way into Mehmed's personal tent to find it empty. Mehmed happened to be somewhere else. Vlad called a retreat. His planned decapitation strike had failed. The next day, the armies finally met in earnest, where Vlad lost 2,000 soldiers and abandoned the capital to Mehmed, running with his shattered army for the safety of the mountains. But he left something behind. As Mehmed and Radu approached Targovishte, their troops saw what from a distance looked like a stand of trees. That is, until they got closer. They were bodies. Ottoman captives from Vlad's depredations along the Danube, and the soldiers he'd snatched during the guerrilla campaign. Men, women, children. All impaled in a macabre display, with birds nesting in their corpses. One account puts the number at 20,000, roughly the amount Vlad himself had claimed to kill in his letter to Matthias Corvinus. But while this terror tactic did shake the approaching Ottoman troops, it actually opened another avenue for Mehmed. He had, after all, brought his favorite Radu the Handsome to replace Vlad, and Vlad's long-standing campaigns of public cruelty and his war on the boyars had not exactly endeared him to what was left of Wallachian nobility. So with Vlad on the run, clearly defeated, boyars increasingly defected to Radu. The new prince, now enthroned at Targovishte, quickly reached out to elements Vlad had clashed with, like the Transylvanian Saxons. A great warrior he was perhaps not, but he was a cunning enough diplomat to offer himself as a more reasonable alternative to his vicious brother, even if he was an Ottoman puppet. Vlad was defeated, out of power, his troops likely deserting in increasing numbers. The only upside was that his fortress on the Black Sea had withstood a siege by both Stephen and Mehmed, but that was cold comfort. And within weeks, Vlad's support had melted to the point that Mehmed went home, leaving Radu to run things, secure on his new throne. Now hiding in the Carpathian Mountains, Vlad had but one hope. See, there was rumors that his old ally, Matthias Corvinus, was marching toward Wallachia with a Hungarian army. So Vlad dispatched messages begging for aid in regaining his throne. And Corvinus came, with a pair of shackles. See, Corvinus didn't necessarily want to battle Mehmed at that moment, but the Pope and Venetians had, after all, given him all that nice money to fight the Ottomans with, and it just seemed like such a waste to use it fighting the Ottomans, you know? But he did have to show he'd done something, so he arrested Vlad, producing several forged letters to prove that Vlad had been collaborating with Mehmed, offering to make war on Hungary in exchange for regaining his throne. And no, it doesn't make a lot of sense. In fact, even Corvinus' court historian seems to think it was a little thin. But Corvinus needed to show the Pope a victory, and uncovering Vlad's treachery was a way to do that without expending his military. So Vlad was a prisoner once again, and would remain one for 14 years. We have little documentation on Vlad during this period, apart from the fact that he was held for a few years and then allowed to settle in a house in Pest, transitioning from being strictly a prisoner to more of an exiled noble forbidden from leaving the country. Though among the few stories we have about him during this time is one violent incident involving Hungarian troops. Apparently, a thief had run and hid in Vlad's home, and then when a squad of troops burst in to pursue him, Vlad had their leader executed on the spot. He'd argued, successfully, that he was within his rights because the troops had not asked for an invitation. Meanwhile, as Vlad stewed, causing a few diplomatic incidents in Pest, Radu lost the throne to another rival, and when the news hit a clearly restless Vlad, he pushed Corvinus to give him an army to recover Wallachia. Because remember, according to Corvinus, Vlad was still the legitimate prince, and Vlad argued he could be useful. But while Corvinus still refused for years to support Vlad, he did increasingly give his pet Wallachian prince a longer and longer leash, letting him move around within Hungary and settle in Transylvania, giving him clearance to gather followers around him, staging Vlad across the border, exactly like all those pretenders had done during Vlad's rule. Corvinus was testing Dracula, seeing if he could trust him.
And in 1476, the biggest test came, when he sent Vlad along on military expeditions against the Ottomans in Bosnia, and to bail Vlad's cousin Stephen out when his relationship with Mehmed soured and the Sultan invaded Moldavia, though it was only a prelude. Within months, a Hungarian army was marching on Targovista, and Vlad and Stephen, armies now united, barely missed capturing the deposed prince as he fled to Mehmed. So in November 1476, Vlad once again became the Prince of Wallachia. In his life, he'd been a hostage, a fugitive exile, a prince, a captive, a general, and both a rebel and an oppressor. He'd carried his sword for the Ottomans, Hungarians, Moldavians, a pope, and a sultan. Now in his mid-40s, it would be his third reign as prince. And though it would only last 2 months, Vlad would live forever. (1476) Constantinople. A messenger stands before Mehmed the Conqueror.